Hi there, everybody. Antonio, Secretary General, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today. And I'm very, very proud and pleased to be the first UK Prime Minister to be chairing the UN Security Council in, I think, 3 decades or more. And the reason I'm proud to be doing this particularly today is because the issue before us, security and climate change and the impact of climate change on global security, is now of absolutely paramount importance. And we'll be talking in a minute about the impacts of climate change on the countries that are worst affected by it, about what we need to do to help. But first of all, I want us all to hear, if you will, for a few moments, from a man who has devoted much of his life to chronicling the threats to all forms of life on our fragile blue planet in absolutely beautiful documentaries, which I trust that you have seen, and a man who understands deeply how that threat has intensified over the last few decades, because he has personally seen it himself with his own eyes and has seen the change unfolding before us. So I'm going to hand over now to Sir David Attenborough.
Thank you, Prime Minister and members of the Security Council. I'm greatly honoured to have this opportunity to speak to you. I'm not a politician, nor am I a diplomat. I speak as a member of the public who listens to your deliberations and pronouncements with care and concern. We know that the security of the entire world depends on your decisions, that you hold the key to preventing a repetition of that global catastrophe, the Great War that took place during my youth and transformed a whole generation. And that awesome responsibility, I know well, still rests with you. But may I plead that today there are threats to security of a new and unprecedented kind. These threats do not divide us. They are threats which should unite us, no matter from which part of the world we come, for they face us all. They are rising global temperatures, the despoiling of the ocean, that vast universal larder on which people everywhere depend for their food. Changes in the pattern of weather worldwide that pay no regard to national boundaries, but that can turn forests into deserts, drown great cities, and lead to the extermination of huge numbers of the other creatures with which we share this planet. No matter what we do now, some of these threats will assuredly become reality within a few short years. Others could, in the lifetime of today's young people, destroy entire cities and societies, even altering the stability of the entire world. The heating of our planet has already reached the point that the impacts on the poorest and most vulnerable people are profound. But this is only the beginning of this crisis. In the last 150 years, the world has warmed on average by just over 1 degree Celsius, and our atmosphere now contains concentrations of carbon dioxide that have not been equaled for millions of years. We are today perilously close to tipping points that, once passed, will send global temperatures spiraling catastrophically higher. If we continue on our current path, we will face the collapse of everything that gives us our security. Food production, access to fresh water, habitable ambient temperature, and ocean food chains. And if the natural world can no longer support the most basic of our needs, then much of the rest of civilization will quickly break down. Please make no mistake. Climate change is the biggest threat to security that modern humans have ever faced. I don't envy you the responsibility that this places on all of you and your governments. We have left the stable and secure climatic period that gave birth to our civilizations. There is no going back. No matter what we do now, it's too late to avoid climate change. And the poorest and most vulnerable, those with the least security, are now certain to suffer. Our duty right now is surely to do all we can to help those in the most immediate danger. But of course, we have a parallel duty. And it's here where I think there are grounds for hope. While it's true we can never go back to the stable, benign climate that enabled us to flourish for the past 10,000 years, I do believe that if we act fast enough, we can reach a new stable state. In November this year, at COP26 in Glasgow, we have what may be our last opportunity to make this step change. If we recognize climate change and the loss of nature as worldwide security threats, as indeed they are, then we may yet act proportionately and in time. The change needed in itself sounds immense, and of course it is. But we already have many of the technologies needed, at least for the initial changes. And perhaps crucially, we also have a level of public support and demand for action that I have myself never seen before. People today all over the world now realize this is no longer an issue which will affect future generations. It is people alive today, and in particular young people, who will live with the consequences of our actions. Politicians and business leaders know this too. Having seen how quickly and radically their societies and global activities were affected by COVID, it is now, sadly, easier to imagine some of the consequences of climate change. Perhaps the most significant lesson brought by these last 12 months has been that we are no longer separate nations, each best served by looking after its own needs and security. We are a single, truly global species whose greatest threats are shared and whose security must ultimately come from acting together in the interests of us all. Climate change is a threat to global security that can only be dealt with by unparalleled levels of global cooperation. It will compel us to question our economic models and where we place value, invent entirely new industries, recognize the moral responsibility that wealthy nations have to the rest of the world, and put a value on nature that goes far beyond money. And through global cooperation, we may achieve far more than tackling climate change. We may finally create a stable, healthy world where resources are equally shared and where we thrive in balance with the rest of the natural world. We may, for the first time in the entire history of humanity, come to know what it feels like to be secure.
Well, I think you will agree it was great to hear from Sir David, and his words strike me as being very, very profound. They are the harvest of a long, long acquaintance with the problem. I'm now going to call this VTC meeting of the Security Council to order and adopt the agenda. And the provisional agenda for this meeting is maintenance of international peace and security, climate change and security. The agenda is adopted. And in accordance with Rule 37 of the Security Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite His Excellency Mr. Lazarus McCarthy Chakwera, President of Malawi, appearing on behalf of the Least Developed Country Group. His Excellency Mr. Gaston Alfonso Brown, Prime Minister and Minister for Finance and Corporate Governance of Antigua and Barbuda, appearing on behalf of the Alliance of Small Island States, and His Excellency Mr. Heiko Maas, Federal Minister for Foreign Affairs of Germany, appearing on behalf of the Group of Friends of Climate Change. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Ms. Nisreen El-Saim, Chair of the UN Youth Advisory Group, to participate in this meeting. Agreed? It is so agreed. So decided, I should say. Item 2 of the agenda. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I wish to draw the attention of Council members to document S/2021/155, a letter dated the 17th of February 2021 from the Permanent Representative of the United Kingdom to the United Nations, addressed to the Secretary General, transmitting a concept paper on the item under consideration. I now invite colleagues to speak, and I give the floor to His Excellency, the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres. Antonio, would you kindly make your remarks?
Thank you very much. Mr. President, Prime Minister Boris Johnson, Excellencies, I thank the British Presidency for convening this debate and for your invitation to brief on a subject of great concern. The climate emergency is the defining issue of our time. The last decade was the hottest in human history. Carbon dioxide levels are at record highs, and wildfires, cyclones, floods, and droughts are the new normal. These shocks not only damage the environment on which we depend, they also weaken our political, economic, and social systems. And the science is clear. We need to limit the global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. And our duty is even clearer. We need to protect the people and communities that are being hit already by climate disruption. We must step up preparations for the escalating implications of the climate crisis for international peace and security. Mr. President, climate disruption is a crisis amplifier and multiplier. Where climate change dries up rivers, reduces harvests, destroys critical infrastructure, and displaces communities, it exacerbates the risks of instability and conflict. A study by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute found that 8 of the 10 countries hosting the largest multilateral peace operations in 2018 were in areas highly exposed to climate change. The impacts of this crisis are greatest where fragility and conflicts have weakened coping mechanisms, where people depend on natural capital like forests and fish stocks for their livelihoods, and where women, who bear the greatest burden of the climate emergency, do not enjoy equal rights. In Afghanistan, for example, where 40% of the workforce is engaged in farming, reduced harvests push people into poverty and food insecurity, leaving them susceptible to recruitment by criminal gangs and armed groups. Across West Africa and the Sahel, more than 50 million people depend on rearing livestock for survival. Changes in grazing patterns have contributed to growing violence and conflict between pastoralists and farmers. In Darfur, low rainfall and recurrent droughts are increasing food insecurity and competition for resources, and we are seeing the result. The consequences are particularly devastating for women and girls who are forced to walk further to collect water, putting them at greater risk of sexual and gender-based violence. Vulnerability to climate risks is also correlated with income inequality. In other words, the poorest suffer more. Unless we protect those most exposed and susceptible to climate-related impacts, we can expect them to become even more marginalized and their grievances to be reinforced. High levels of inequality that climate change enhances can weaken social cohesion and lead to discrimination, scapegoating, rising tensions and unrest, increasing the risk of conflict. Those who are already being left behind will be left even farther behind. Climate disruption is already driving displacement across the world. In some small island nations in the Pacific, entire communities have been forced to relocate with terrible implications for their livelihoods, culture, and heritage. The forced movement of larger numbers of people around the world will clearly increase the potential for conflict and insecurity beyond their suffering. When I was High Commissioner for Refugees, I spent time with people who had been uprooted by the impact of climate change in the Horn of Africa, in Darfur, the Sahel, and elsewhere. And listening to their stories, I understood the deep suffering and trauma of families forced to abandon homes and land that had been theirs for generations. Mr. President, much more needs to be done to address the specific risks that climate crisis poses to peace and security. And I see 4 priority areas. First, we need a greater focus on prevention through strong, ambitious climate action. We must get the world on track to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement and avoid climate catastrophe. We must create a truly global coalition to commit to net zero emissions by the middle of the century. And we must mobilize a decade of transformation through a successful COP26 in Glasgow. That requires all member states to present well before November ambitious national determined contributions with targets that will allow us to cut global emissions by 45% by 2030 from 2010 levels. We are also asking all companies, cities, and financial institutions to prepare concrete and credible decarbonization plans. We still have a long way to go, and we look to the major emitters to lead by example in the coming months. This is a credibility test of their commitment to people and planet. And it's the only way we will keep the 1.5-degree goal within reach. Second, we need immediate actions to protect countries, communities, and people from increasingly frequent and severe climate impacts. We need a breakthrough on adaptation and resilience, which means dramatically raising the level of investments. All donors and multilateral national development banks must increase the share of adaptation and resilience finance to at least 50% of their climate finance support. And we must make these funds accessible to those on the front lines of the climate crisis. And developed countries must keep their pledge of channeling $100 billion annually to the global south. They have already missed the deadline of 2020. We need to scale up early warning systems and early action on climate-related crises, from droughts and storms to the emergence of zoonotic diseases. And we also need stronger social protection to support those impacted. These actions must start now with transformative policies as we emerge from the pandemic. Economic and financial systems must incorporate climate risks into financial analysis so that it is captured in business models and investment decisions. We must invest in renewable energy and green infrastructure. In short, we must close the finance gap by increasing support to the countries and communities that are suffering the worst impacts of the climate crisis. And that support must reach women and girls who bear the brunt of the climate crisis and constitute 80% of those displaced by climate change. Third, we need to embrace a concept of security that puts people at its center. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown the devastation that so-called non-traditional security threats can cause on a global scale. Preventing and addressing the poverty, food insecurity, and displacement caused by climate disruption contributes to sustaining peace and reducing the risk of conflict. The Nobel Committee recognized these when it awarded the Nobel Peace Prize to the World Food Programme last year. Respect for human rights, particularly women's rights, the rule of law, inclusion and diversity, are fundamental to solving the climate crisis and creating more peaceful and stable societies. The 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals are a global blueprint for action. Monsieur le Président, la quatrième priorité, c'est le renforcement des partenariats au sein du système des Nations Unies et au-delà. Nous devons tirer parti des compétences des différents acteurs, notamment de ce Conseil, de la Commission de consolidation de la paix, des institutions financières internationales, des organisations régionales, de la société civile, du secteur privé, des universités et d'autres encore. Le mécanisme de sécurité climatique qui réunit le département des affaires politiques et de la consolidation de la paix, le programme des Nations Unies pour le développement, et le programme des Nations Unies pour l'environnement constituent un modèle pour ce type de collaboration au sein du système des Nations Unies. Tandis que l'Organisation des Nations Unies travaille à la réalisation de ces objectifs, nous nous efforçons de montrer l'exemple en veillant à ce que nos propres opérations tiennent pleinement compte de la crise climatique. Nous œuvrons afin de nous assurer que nos stratégies de médiation, nos analyses et nos rapports, y compris à l'intention du Conseil de sécurité, prennent systématiquement en compte les risques climatiques. Au Soudan du Sud, par exemple, notre opération de maintien de la paix s'est appuyée sur les données de l'impact des changements climatiques pour négocier un accord local sur la gestion du bétail. Au Yémen, le Fonds pour la consolidation de la paix a soutenu l'action visant à restaurer et à renforcer les structures locales de gouvernance de l'eau, atténuant ainsi les tensions intercommunautaires. Nous réduisons également l'empreinte écologique de l'Organisation des Nations Unies, grâce notamment à l'utilisation accrue des énergies renouvelables dans nos missions. Monsieur le Président, la crise climatique est le défi multilatéral de notre époque. Elle a déjà des répercussions sur tous les domaines de l'activité humaine. Surmonter cette crise requiert une coordination et une coopération d'une envergure encore inédite à l'échelle mondiale. L'engagement de tous les organismes multilatéraux, notamment de ce Conseil, peut jouer un rôle décisif dans cette entreprise. J'exhorte les membres du Conseil à user de leur influence au cours de cette année charnière pour assurer le succès de la COP26 et à mobiliser les autres acteurs, notamment les institutions financières internationales et le secteur privé, pour qu'ils fassent leur part. Prime Minister Boris Johnson, I guarantee the full support of the United Nations for the British presidency of COP26, together with your Italian co-chairs. 2021 is a make-or-break year for collective action against the climate emergency. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Antonio, for your terrific remarks just now, and also for your continued leadership at the UN on this issue on climate change in the run-up to COP26. And it's great to be working with you on it, Antonio, with other colleagues I can see there on the screen. I now want to go to, I now give the floor, I should say, according to the protocol. I now give the floor to Ms. Nisreen El Saim, Chair of the UN Youth Advisory Group.
Assalamu alaikum. Your Excellency, President of the Security Council, Your Excellencies, Member of the Security Council, Mr. Antonio Guterres, United Nations Secretary General, ladies and gentlemen, young people who are watching us online around the world. Let me first start by thanking Security Council members for allowing me to speak on this important and crucial issue. I would like also to extend special thanks to the Presidency of the Security Council, the UK, for the invitation. The Security Council has held 6 open debates specifically on climate security risks. in 2007, 2011, 2018, and 2019, and 2 events in 2020. And has included reference to climate security risks in resolutions related to Somalia, Sudan, West Africa, the Sahel, Mali, and Lake Chad Basin. Science has forecasted many more countries will be joining this list if we did not take the right measures now, and if we did not start adaptation, especially in the African continent. The United Nations Security Council, in the 17th of April 2007, held a groundbreaking open debate at the ministerial level on the relationship between energy security and climate. And in the same year, the 8th United Nations Secretary General, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, described the conflict in Darfur as the first modern climate conflict. Now, after almost 14 years, this same agenda item is still valid, and we are discussing climate security. Well, for a Sudanese young person, everything regarding climate change cannot be affiliated with the word security. We are living in a continuous insecurity due to many factors that put Sudan on top of the list when it comes to climate vulnerability. In 2018, the Security Council issued a resolution about Sudan, and I quote, recognizing the adverse effects of climate change, ecological changes, and natural disasters, among other factors, on the situation in Darfur, including through droughts, desertification, and land degradation, and food insecurity. This paragraph and others describe it all. Humans are survival. In a situation of resources degradation, hunger, poverty, and uncontrolled climate migration will make conflict as inevitable result. Moreover, climate-related emergencies causes major disruptions in access to health, life-saving, sexual and reproductive health service, and everything. Climate-related loss or changes of livelihoods, as well as displacement and migration, increases the risk of gender-based violence and harmful practices. It's also worth mentioning that women, youth, and children get repeatedly impacted in these climate insecure situations. Land and resources in Africa and many other parts of the world, because of climate change, can no longer maintain young people. In our research of a decent life, good and green jobs, proper access to services, and including a new challenge of the COVID-19 makes the only solution in front of many will be migration. In-country migration, cross-border or internationally, legal or non-legal, giving more rise to conflicts. I welcome very much the Security Council decision for the new political mission, UNITAMS, which, unlike military missions, can have mandate on climate change and on youth inclusion. This is a historical opportunity to speak to the root causes of the conflict. What I welcome most is mentioning climate change and youth participation twice in the same resolution. What I appreciate more is the inclusion of climate change and environmental degradation in Juba Peace Agreement and in 2 other areas agreement, which reflects a high sense of threats in the peace sustainability and to the peace process. Collecting data about conflict and climate change, consulting local communities, and trusting in science will be my key recommendations for today. As a young person, I'm sure that young people are the solution. Give us more space, listen to us, engage youth. We are the present, we have the future. Let's not repeat the previous generation's lapse. No more doubt. Stop conflicts by stopping climate change. Give us security, secure the future. I thank you very much.
Well, I thank you very much, Nisreen. Thank you very much for that very, very important contribution, and one I think everybody should be listening to around the world. And I'm just going to say a bit now myself in my capacity as Prime Minister of the UK, momentarily ceasing to occupy the role of President of the Council, I'm just going to tell you what I think. And I think that for more than 75 years, this Security Council has been tasked with maintaining peace and security, and it's been difficult. We haven't always agreed about how to achieve that goal, but one thing is absolutely clear to me, that we are committed to tackling threats to our security, and as you've heard from Antonio and from Nisreen, it is absolutely clear that climate change is a threat to our collective security and the security of our nations. And I know that there are people around the world who will say that this is all kind of green stuff from a bunch of tree-hugging tofu munchers and not suited to international diplomacy and international politics. I couldn't disagree more profoundly. The causes of climate change we've got to address, but the effects, as you've heard from Nisreen, you've heard from Antonio, in those speeches just now, are absolutely clear. Think of a young man forced onto the road when his home becomes a desert, one of 16 million people displaced every year as a result of weather-related disasters, and weather-related disasters that are associated with climate change. He goes to some camp, he becomes prey for violent extremists, people who radicalize him, and the effects of that radicalization are felt around the world. Think of a girl who drops out of school because her daily search for water takes her further and further from her family and into the clutches of human traffickers and the international criminal gangs who profit from them. Or think of a farmer who has lost harvest after harvest to drought and then switches to poppies because poppies are a hardier crop, with the impacts that the opium crops have on the streets of all our cities, quite frankly. Or think of the impoverished and fragile nation whose government collapses when critical infrastructure is overwhelmed by increasingly frequent extreme weather of a kind that sends shockwaves of instability around the world. Now, if that kind of result in terms of political, economic, humanitarian impact, if that was being triggered by some kind of despotic warlord or civil war, then nobody would question the right and the duty of this UN Security Council to act. And therefore, it is not a subject that we can shy away from. This isn't, by the way, like so many of the issues that I know you confront, Antonio, this isn't some bafflingly complex diplomatic minuet. This isn't some modern equivalent of the Schleswig-Holstein question. Can you remember the answer to the Schleswig-Holstein question, Antonio? I bet you can. People know the answer to climate change, and they know how to tackle this crisis. And as Bill Gates put it in his new book, what we've got to do is go from 51 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions each year to net zero. So the increase in global temperatures remains at manageable levels. And as we do so, we must support the more vulnerable and the fragile nations that are feeling the effects of climate change and help them to adapt and to build resilience. And that's what we're doing. So last year, we passed a law committing us in the UK to achieving net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And we've pledged to slash emissions by 68% by 2030. That's the steepest reduction for any major economy. And our climate finance commitments for the next 5 years, supporting the rest of the world to achieve this, stand at £11.6 billion. And ahead of the COP26 summit, we're going to be putting climate change firmly at the top of the agenda for our G7 presidency as well. So my message to you all today is now the UN Security Council has got to act too, because climate change is a geopolitical issue every bit as much as it is an environmental one. And if this council is going to succeed in maintaining peace and security worldwide, then it's got to galvanize the whole range of UN agencies, organizations, and into a swift and effective response. If we don't act now, when will we act? That's my question. When are we going to do something if we don't act now? When changing sea levels are affecting our navigation around our coasts, or when, as Nisreen said, when huddled masses fleeing drought or wildfire or conflict over resources arrive at our borders. Whether you like it or not, it is a matter of when, not if, your country and your people will have to deal with the security impacts of climate change. So let's do what this council was created to do, and let's show the kind of global leadership that is needed to protect the peace, the security, and the stability of our nations, of our regions, and of our world. Thank you all very much. I'm now going to go to the distinguished members, representatives present, and invite the council members to speak in the order on that you have before you. And I'm going to begin with His Excellency President Kais Saied, the President of Tunisia.
شكرا لكم، وأريد أن أبدأ هذه المداخلة من حيث بدأنا وبدأ الحديث عن تغير المناخ. القضية ليست لم تعد متى، القضية اليوم لنبدأ. وأريد أن أؤكد على ما تم تأكيده من قبل عدد من المتدخلين وخاصة من السيدة نسرين. نعم، الشباب هو الحاضر وهو المستقبل، فليستمع إليه العالم كله. ثم أن مفهوم الأمن كما تعلمون لم يعد المفهوم التقليدي المألوف والمعروف، بل هو كما قاله السيد الأمين العام هو الذي يضع الإنسان في القلب. نحن نضع الإنسان أيضا في القلب لا في حافظة النقود. السيد الرئيس، أستسمحكم في البداية أن أتوجه إليكم بخالص الشكر، أن أتوجه إلى المملكة المتحدة على اختيارها على تخصيص جلسة اليوم لموضوع مجابهة المخاطر الكثيرة والمتعددة الجوانب المرتبطة بالتغيرات المناخية والخطرة على السلم والأمن الدوليين. وهي مسألة توليها الجمهورية التونسية الاهتمام البالغ الجديرة بها من خلال عضويتها الحالية بمجلسكم الموقر وفي إطار الهياكل الأممية والإقليمية الأخرى. كما توجه بالشكر الجزيل إلى معالي الأمين العام للأمم المتحدة على إحاطته القيمة، وأعرب له عن تقديرنا الصادق لجهوده ودعمنا للأولويات التي رسمها لسنة 21 و2000، وخاصة منها دفع الدول الأعضاء للعمل على الحد من التغيرات المناخية وحشد الدعم اللازم لمجابهة تأثيراتها المتعددة، تأثيراتها على السلم وعلى الأمن بمفهوميهما الواسعين. أتوجه أيضا بالشكر الجزيل إلى بقية مقدمي الإحاطات على مداخلاتهم وعلى إسهاماتهم وعلى الآثار التي تقدموا بها في هذا النقاش حول جملة القضايا المصيرية التي تواجهها الإنسانية جمعاء. السيد الرئيس، أنه لمن المفارقات أن يكون الإنسان هو أول ضحايا التغيرات المناخية، وهو المسؤول الأول عن هذه التغيرات وعن توسع نقاطها. ومع ذلك يبقى الأمل في الحد منها وتخفيف آثارها قائما إذا ما تم الإيمان من قبل الكافة بقيمة العمل الجماعي ورد الموحد على الأخطار المشتركة. فليس من حق الإنسان مهما كان موقفه أن يغتال نفسه بنفسه ويغتال معه الإنسانية جمعاء. لقد تم التأكيد حينما تم التقدم بالمبادرة التي تمخض عنها اعتماد القرار رقم 2532 لسنة 20 و2000 أن الأخطار المحدقة بالأمن والسلم الدوليين لم تعد مقتصرة على الأخطار التقليدية الناشئة عن الحروب وعن النزاعات، وإنما هناك تهديدات أخرى، وهي تهديدات مستجدة خطيرة لا تقل خطرا عن الحروب والنزاعات المسلحة، ومن بينها الأوبئة والفقر والهشاشة. فإذا كانت الأوبئة خطرا، وإذا كانت النزاعات المسلحة بدورها خطرا، فإن التغيرات المناخية تمثل بدورها خطرا لا يقل جسامة عن الأخطار المألوفة والمعهودة للأسف. أنا ما ينجم عن هذه التغيرات المناخية من تعميق للفقر لدى الفئات الضعيفة، ومن تهديد للأمن الغذائي والمائي في عديد المناطق من العالم، وخاصة في القارة الإفريقية، من شأنه أن يعصف بالإمكانيات الاقتصادية والاجتماعية للدول، ويحد ترتيبا على ذلك من قدرتها على احتواء التداعيات الخطيرة الناجمة عن مثل هذه الصعوبات والتصدي لها. وما نعيشه اليوم من صور مأساوية للوضع البيئي، هذا الذي نعيشه ينذر بما ستكون عليه الأوضاع في عدد متزايد من المناطق عبر العالم في ظل تفاقم عوامل الهشاشة البيئية ودورها في تعميق الأزمات وإطالة أمد النزاعات المسلحة وخلق مناخ للتهميش والإقصاء وانتشار التنظيمات الإرهابية والتطرف العنيف والجريمة المنظمة، بالإضافة إلى ارتفاع موجات الهجرة غير النظامية واحتدام الصراعات على منابع المياه ومصادر الغذاء. السيد الرئيس، أمام هذا الوضع الدقيق أجدد دعوتنا لمجلس الأمن من أجل مقاربة جديدة يتم إرساؤها من أجل مقاربة شاملة لمعالجة هذه الأخطار البيئية، لمعالجة أسبابها قبل معالجة نتائجها. كما ندعو إلى توفير الدعم المادي اللازم للهيئات الأممية والدولية والإقليمية المتخصصة لتمكينها من القيام بدورها في مواجهة هذه الأخطار عبر تطوير قدراتها التحليلية والتقييمية والأخطار التي يمكن تجنبها بإحداث آليات للإنذار المبكر وضبط استراتيجيات وقائية فعالة. ولا أشك أبدا في أننا قادرون على ذلك. لقد أكدت العديد من الكوارث الطبيعية والصحية، وآخرها جائحة كوفيد-19، هذه الجائحة التي لم تستثني أحدا، أكدت مرة أخرى أهمية تعزيز التضامن الدولي بين شعوبنا، وأكدت ضرورة التفكير في إعادة بناء منظوماتنا الاقتصادية والمالية والاجتماعية والصحية بشكل يراعي احتياجات الطبيعة ويعمل على تقليص من التأثيرات المناخية وانبعاثات الغازات السامة. وهي قطعا مسؤولية نشترك فيها جميعا، تشترك كل الدول فيها شمالا وجنوبا، لكنها تتفاوت حسب مسؤولية كل طرف في التسبب في هذه التغيرات المناخية، كما أن تنفيذ إجراءات التصدي لهذه التغيرات لا يمكن أن يكون من جهة واحدة بل من الجميع، ولا يمكن أن يكون على حساب الدول النامية وحقها المشروع في التنمية وفي الرخاء وفي الازدهار. وفي الختام أود التأكيد على ما توليه تونس لقضايا البيئة من خلال إدراج تغير المناخ كأولوية وطنية في نص دستورها. كما نجدد التأكيد على التزام تونس بالعمل الدولي من أجل معالجة هذه التهديدات المستجدة للسلم والأمن الدوليين، ونؤكد عزمنا الثابتة والراسخة مواصلة الجهود للدفع باتجاه تطوير عمل مجلس الأمن في هذا المجال. إننا سنسعى من أجل أن تكون الأمم متحدة بالفعل، فلا يعرض الإنسان نفسه بنفسه للخطر بحثا عن ربح سيزول حين تنسى حقوق الإنسان، بل حين تغتال هذه الحقوق شيئا فشيئا بفعل انتشار الغازات وتفشي سمومها، ولن تستثني هذه الغازات يومئذ أحدا. وشكرا لكم على الإصغاء والمتابعة.
Well, I want to thank the President of Tunisia very much indeed for that excellent speech. Thank you, Your Excellency. And I'm going to hand over in a minute to my friend, His Excellency, the President of Kenya, Uhuru Kenyatta, President of Kenya. But before I give the floor to Uhuru, I just want to say, regrettably, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, dear colleagues, I'm going to have to leave after Uhuru has spoken, after the President of Kenya, because I have to go and attend to other things here. But I want to say how, and I'll be handing over to Dom Raab, the Foreign Secretary, to chair the rest of the proceedings. But I just want to repeat how absolutely vital these are for us and I believe for the world. But Uhuru, over to you.
We can't hear you, President. Please check your microphone.
You need to unmute, I think.
I think I've done so. You got me? Great.
Yes,
thank you very much, Boris. Thank you very much, Prime Minister, for this opportunity. Your Excellency Antonio Guterres, our Secretary General. Excellencies present, all protocols observed. Let me begin by congratulating you, Boris, on your continued stewardship of the Security Council for the month of February 2021. And let me say, Mr. President, that I also welcome this high-level debate as our understanding of climate change continues to reveal its important role as a multiplier of existing threats to international peace and security. The international community has responded elsewhere to the threat of climate change with ambitious solutions that are actually transforming economic development through investment that seeks to minimize environmental, social, as well as governance harms. But I also believe, as has been stated by previous speakers, that to ensure that these new approaches to investment by the public and private sector reach the countries and regions worst hit by climate change. I believe as a start, we can recognize that the persistent droughts and constant sea level rises and increasingly frequent extreme weather patterns are reversing economic gains and development gains achieved over decades. The result is increased fragility, increased instability that leads to armed conflict that then comes to the attention of this Security Council. So the implementation of the Council's mandate to maintain global peace and security will only get more difficult with time if climate change remains a persistent course. And rather than wait for a future tipping point, we must redouble our efforts today to direct our resources and multilateral frameworks of all our rule-based international orders to mitigate the effects of climate change. While the bulk of this work is happening outside the Security Council, as it should be, nobody with such a strong mandate should step aside from this challenge. And that is why it is one of our priorities in Kenya during our term in the Security Council to clarify the importance of the climate and security nexus. Mr. President, the nexus is already impacting Africa, whose files dominate your Council's agenda. And in this regard, I would ask you to listen to us Africans when we tell you that there is a clear link that has impacted tangibly and therefore needs urgent solutions. Africa, unfortunately, will suffer the worst consequences of climate change, despite being the least responsible for global greenhouse gases. And projected climate changes for Africa suggest a future of increased water insecurity, decreased agricultural yields, encroaching desert, as well as damaged coastal infrastructure. Examples abound of the consequences. The drought-stricken Horn of Africa, our part of the world, the drying of the Lake Chad Basin, the shrinking Sahel and savanna grasslands have worsened economic vulnerabilities and set in motion political, demographic, migratory dynamics that increase the threat of insurgency and violent extremism. Indeed, I do hope that the Council will listen more carefully and respond to the new innovative tools for climate-related conflict prevention and resilience building that can emerge from Peace-Building Commission and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the UN Environmental Programme. And I strongly urge these bodies to link early warning systems that map climate change hotspots to decision-making. Tools that enable conflict prevention at national, regional, as well as international levels. Such tools include the building of a dynamic and accessible modeling at the national, regional levels that allow government and the multilateral, as well as private sector, to deploy solutions in a security-conscious, forward-looking manner. For such innovative work to have policy impact, it will require democratized access to critical data and much more data sharing with African institutions, engineers, as well as researchers. So, Mr. President, allow me to finish with basically two recommendations that I believe can be immediately acted upon by this Council. In crafting mandates for conflict resolution and post-conflict resolution, we can do more to ensure that they dovetail with the efforts to deploy climate change mitigation and adaptation measures. And in this regard, I want to applaud the Security Council Resolution 2349 on Lake Chad and 2502 in the Democratic Republic of Congo with regard to MONUSCO that have created measures to address the impact of climate change. Fragile countries experiencing armed conflict or the threat of it receive little public or private investment. The lack of employment and opportunity in turn worsens the political as a security crisis. The Council and relevant UN and international financial institutions that respond to its resolutions can help alleviate this challenge by aligning conflict resolution, peacekeeping, humanitarian aid, post-conflict reconstruction with job creation by the domestic private sector. Another important and prompt action that the Council can take to boost peace and security in the most fragile regions in Africa is to act strongly against illicit financial outflows, illicit resource exploitation, terrorism financing, and money laundering. And in this regard, Mr. Prime Minister, I laud you and your government for your efforts in this regard. Doing so immediately boosts the resources available to government to undertake climate change mitigation and offer the public services and goods needed to consolidate it and protect our peace. It also disrupts the negative forces who worsen the threat of climate change by making it tougher to tackle its security impact. So in conclusion, Mr. President, let me affirm that Kenya will remain a strong voice for Africa, for the global South, including small island developing states, in making the case for climate change and security nexus. The world expects results and is looking forward to this Security Council to ever more effectively fulfill its mandate. A growing part of that work is likely to involve the conflict impacts of climate change. Once again, Boris, I want to thank you for your invitation and thank you for putting us together. And I also want to thank all the members for their kind attention. Let's get to work and let's see if we can make some progress towards this great end. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. President Uhuru, for that terrific speech. Thanks for your leadership, your call to work there, and for making that crucial point that Africa bears the brunt of this crisis, the impact of climate change, and yet, of course, Africa of all the continents has probably contributed the least to the global emissions that we face. So thank you very much for that. Sadly, I have to depart, but I'm leaving you in the excellent hands of the Foreign Secretary, who is about to appear.
Please go ahead.
Hello, everyone. I've taken over seamlessly from my Prime Minister, and without further ado, I will now give the floor to His Excellency Minister Birji Rafini, Prime Minister of Niger. Prime Minister, you have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs les chefs d'État et de gouvernement. Je prends la parole à ce débat de haut niveau du Conseil de sécurité des Nations Unies au nom du Président de la République du Niger, Son Excellence Issoufou Mahamadou, qui n'a malheureusement pas pu se joindre à vous pour des raisons de calendrier. C'est pourquoi il m'a chargé de vous transmettre son soutien et ses vœux de succès pour le présent débat. À présent, je voudrais vous livrer le message qu'il a souhaité partager avec vous. Monsieur le Président, Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs les chefs d'État et de gouvernement, permettez-moi tout d'abord de saluer le Royaume-Uni pour son engagement à maintenir la question des risques sécuritaires liés au changement climatique sur l'agenda du Conseil. Je voudrais également remercier M. Antonio Guterres ainsi que Nisrin Elsem pour leurs interventions et leur ferme engagement à faire prendre en compte l'impact des changements climatiques sur les questions de paix et de sécurité. Monsieur le Président, comme l'ont si bien rappelé le secrétaire général et les autres intervenants, l'impact du changement climatique sur la paix et la sécurité est de plus en plus évident. Il est aujourd'hui indéniable que les phénomènes climatiques inversent la trajectoire de développement à travers plusieurs régions du monde, amplifiant des crises humanitaires et sécuritaires. Selon une récente étude de la Banque mondiale, la raréfaction en eau exacerbée par le changement climatique pourrait affecter les économies et conduire certaines régions du monde, telles que le Sahel, à enregistrer un recul du PIB de l'ordre de 6%, provoquer des migrations massives de la population et générer des conflits. En outre, le changement climatique pourrait augmenter la faim et la malnutrition de 20% d'ici 2050 et accroître la pauvreté, en particulier pour les 2,5 milliards de petits producteurs dont les moyens de subsistance dépendent du climat et de son impact sur leurs conditions de production. Ainsi, au Sahel, creusé de cette réalité, le changement climatique a intensifié la compétition autour des ressources foncières, fourragères et hydriques déjà en baisse, ce qui a attisé les tensions entre éleveurs et agriculteurs et entravé les efforts de consolidation de la paix et de développement dans la région. Monsieur le Président, mon premier message porte sur notre responsabilité collective de prendre en compte ce défi existentiel visant à un changement de paradigme. Le changement climatique et la dégradation des terres ne se limitent plus à une question d'ordre environnemental, mais s'inscrit désormais dans une vision plus large qui lie étroitement les objectifs environnementaux aux objectifs de développement économique et social et partant à notre objectif commun qu'est la paix, la stabilité et la sécurité du monde. Tout comme nous l'avons fait pour la pandémie de la COVID-19, nous nous devons de consolider le changement climatique comme une menace, de considérer le changement climatique comme une menace à la paix et à la sécurité, et cela ne doit pas être source de division. Nous devons œuvrer ensemble, avec encore plus d'ardeur, pour traduire nos connaissances et politiques en des actions concrètes. Il est donc important de comprendre les causes, les effets et la complexité du changement climatique afin de pouvoir les combattre. Car notre objectif n'est pas seulement de gérer les conflits. Nous avons la responsabilité fondamentale de les prévenir. C'est un appel à l'action à travers une approche intégrée et coordonnée. Dans le cas des efforts des Nations Unies et du Conseil de sécurité, un investissement accru dans les actions de prévention et d'anticipation dans les États fragiles pourrait limiter les conséquences humanitaires combinées du changement climatique et des conflits armés. À cet égard, nous appelons au renforcement de la capacité de ce Conseil à comprendre l'impact du changement climatique sur la sécurité par la production de rapports réguliers du secrétaire général qui intégrera une analyse approfondie des risques actuels et futurs, ainsi que des recommandations orientées vers l'action. J'en appelle également à une prise en compte systématique de ces risques dans les résolutions se rapportant à des contextes de situations spécifiques des pays et régions, car cela peut accroître l'efficacité des efforts de consolidation et de maintien de la paix. En ce sens, je voudrais encourager le Conseil à s'appuyer autant que possible sur le rôle consultatif de la Commission de consolidation de la paix, ainsi que sur le groupe d'experts informels sur le climat et la sécurité, coprésidé par le Niger et l'Irlande. Ces cadres, de même que les données qui nous sont fournies par les instituts de recherche, nous permettent d'avoir une perspective sur les processus nationaux et régionaux, qui sont autant d'outils pour mieux informer le Conseil de sécurité sur les implications du changement climatique sur la paix et la sécurité. De plus, la nomination d'un envoyé spécial du secrétaire général pour le climat et la sécurité nous semble opportune, dans la mesure où elle donnera plus de visibilité et d'efficacité à la prise en compte de cette dimension dans les actions du Conseil. Monsieur le Président, les effets du changement climatique ne connaissent pas de frontières. Nous partageons donc la responsabilité de les gérer collectivement pour atteindre les objectifs de développement durable. Sans de meilleures stratégies d'adaptation et de renforcement de la résilience consacrée à gérer et restaurer notre capital naturel de manière responsable, le changement climatique en Afrique de l'Ouest et au Sahel continuera d'être un facteur important de risque, menaçant les moyens de subsistance des populations des zones rurales, provoquant des migrations forcées et aggravant les conflits autour des ressources naturelles de plus en plus limitées. Mon troisième message porte sur l'importance de changer la perception sur les régions les plus affectées par les risques sécuritaires liés au changement du climat, particulièrement le Sahel. Trop souvent, les récits et discours autour de ces zones se limitent aux défis et aux vulnérabilités. Ils ignorent les opportunités et les potentiels de ces régions en termes d'atouts naturels, démographiques et culturels. Nous avons les capacités de tirer profit de ces opportunités à travers l'innovation technologique et la création d'emplois durables, particulièrement dans les secteurs clés tels que l'énergie et l'agriculture. L'infrastructure énergétique limitée, la répartition de la population sur un très vaste territoire et l'aridité du climat, qui étaient jadis considérées comme autant de conditions désavantageuses, constituent désormais un atout pour autant que cette région, désormais un atout pour cette région, mais également pour l'Afrique dans son ensemble. Cette vision peut se concrétiser à condition qu'elle soit soutenue par un engagement ferme et une volonté politique conséquente. C'est pourquoi en Afrique, et particulièrement dans la région du Sahel, un grand espoir a été placé dans l'entrée en vigueur de l'accord de Paris sur le climat. Cet accord a, entre autres, généré une initiative phare en Afrique, adoptée lors du sommet africain de l'action en faveur d'une coémergence continentale tenue au Maroc en marge de la COP 22 sur le climat. En l'occurrence, la création des 3 commissions climat pour l'Afrique, dont celle de la région du Sahel que j'ai l'honneur de présider et qui regroupe 17 pays. Pour son opérationnalisation, la commission climat pour la région du Sahel s'est dotée d'un plan d'investissement climatique d'un coût global d'environ 440 milliards de dollars, avec pour objectif de contribuer à l'effort planétaire d'atténuation des émissions de gaz à effet de serre et d'accroître les capacités d'adaptation et de résilience des populations sahéliennes. Il a fait l'objet d'une table ronde pour son financement et d'une réunion consultative de haut niveau que j'ai présidée le 22 septembre 2019 à New York, réunion qui a enregistré la participation de hautes personnalités, dont le secrétaire général des Nations Unies. Pour terminer, je voudrais, au nom de la Commission climat pour la région du Sahel, inviter chaque pays parti à la Convention des Nations Unies sur le changement climatique à jouer pleinement sa partition dans ses rôles et responsabilités afin de réussir ensemble à inverser la trajectoire du changement climatique. Le chemin qui reste à parcourir est encore très long et les conséquences de l'inaction climatique encore plus désastreuses pour les générations actuelles et futures. Nous devons avancer les yeux ouverts et tous ensemble. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister, Your Excellency, for highlighting in particular the crucial link between tackling climate change and sustainable economic development and regional security. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Nguyen Xuan Phuc, Prime Minister of Vietnam. Prime Minister, you have the floor.
Mr. Representative of the President, I applaud the initiative of the UK government and yourself, Mr. President, to host this important UNSC open debate on addressing climate-related risk to international peace and security. I would like to thank the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres and the chair of the UN Youth Advisory Group, Nisrin Ensayim, for your insightful and substantive information and recommendations. Mr. President, Earth, our blue planet, and our shared home is suffering from grievous impacts of climate change. 2020 was one of the 3 hottest years in modern history and was faced with constant and severe aftermaths of floods, droughts, bushfires, rising sea level, and the unprecedented COVID-19 outbreak. Such calamities have placed great burdens on the political and socio-economic life of many countries. They have caused unemployment and poverty, affected livelihood of hundreds of millions of people, and risk creating instabilities and exacerbating present conflicts in many countries and regions, thus threatening international peace and security. In addition, conflicts and instabilities would further erode countries' resilience and rob them of valuable resources that could have been utilized to overcome the challenges of climate change. Therefore, I propose that UNSC, with its foremost mission being the maintenance of international peace and security, needs to galvanize collective and persevering efforts of the international community via the following measures. First, a comprehensive and balanced approach is necessary in handling the connections between traditional and non-traditional security challenges, particularly in addressing the root causes of conflicts such as poverty, inequality, power politics, and unilateral interference and coercion. Strict adherence to the UN Charter and international law must truly become a standard of behavior for countries in international relations. Second, for the 2013 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement to be effectively implemented, the UNSC and the international community should allocate greater resources to support developing countries, least developed countries, small island developing states, and landlocked countries that are most detrimentally affected by climate change and are also lacking expertise and resources. Third, I hope that UNSC will continue to enhance its early warning capacity and bolster its role in mediating, preventing, and resolving conflicts in own regions, including through enhancing cooperation with regional organizations. Fourth, in order to harmoniously manage connection between climate change and security, it's necessary to continue upholding the principles of respect for sovereignty, national ownership, and principal responsibilities of states. The shared interests of communities and peoples, particularly vulnerable groups, must be placed at the heart of all national and global climate action strategy and plans. Mr. President, Vietnam is among the 10 countries was hit by climate change. Third, active and effective response to climate change is both a major guideline and strong political resolve by the Vietnamese government. Vietnam has made great efforts to fulfill its international commitments on climate change. In this connection, we support all endeavors to address climate-related challenges at the UNSC and other multilateral forums. I hope that the international community will provide Vietnam with further assistance and resources so that we can better fulfill our commitments. Vietnam will work closely with other ASEAN members and support cooperation between ASEAN and the UN. Mr. President, the world is burdened with the fight against COVID-19. Responding to the appeal of the UN Secretary General, making peace with nature is the defining task of the 21st century. We should take bold actions and enhance international unity. I'm confident that the challenges stemming from climate change can be transformed into drivers for change, contributing to fostering future peace and more sustainable development for next generations. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. May I now turn to give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Erna Solberg, Prime Minister of Norway. Prime Minister, you have the floor.
Thank you, President. And I'd like to start by thanking the United Kingdom for placing this issue on the Security Council's agenda. I would also like to thank the briefers, the Secretary General and Nasrin El-Saim for setting the stage. And I think 2020 was the hottest year on record. We've seen heat waves, we've seen wildfires, and we have seen floods affected, who has affected the lives of millions. I think 270 million people have acute food insecurity. Climate shocks are key drivers to this. If you look at the Sahel, climate change affects ecosystems and livelihoods. Increased competition over scarce resources fuels these conflicts. In Somalia and the Lake Chad, climate impacts have enabled armed groups to boost recruitment. And on the Horn of Africa and in the Middle East, climate change escalates the risk of conflicts. Ocean warming, illegal fishing, and sea level rise threatens the coastal and small island nations. So, like the farmers in the Sahel, fishermen in the Pacific find it difficult to maintain their livelihood. The biodiversity crisis and deforestation affect security of many. These are closely interlinked with climate change and can hamper peace and development. So what we do is we risk a negative spiral. Climate change undermines the ability to cope with conflict, and conflict undermines resilience to climate change. President, climate change is redefining the global security landscape. But there is no single solution. We must adapt our responses to different contexts. Climate change is expected to displace more than 140 million people by 2050. 12 of the 20 countries most vulnerable to climate change are also dealing with violent conflict. We must rethink and adapt the Council's approaches to peace building and sustaining peace in 3 ways. First, the Council needs better information on climate-related security risk. International research networks and informal expert groups will be important here. To support our work, NOVA has engaged NUPI and CEPRI to establish a Nordic-Baltic expert network. And we fully support the work of the Climate Security Mechanism. So I echo the call for regular reports by the Secretary General to the Council. A special representative on climate and security should also be appointed. Climate risks must be considered in all prevention, peacekeeping, and peace-building activities. This goes for the Security Council, but also for the member states, the UN Secretariat, and of course the leadership of UN operations. Second, the Security Council should discuss climate risk in specific country contexts, based on country reporting and briefings. The UN must be at the forefront of preventive diplomacy. To achieve sustainable solutions, our peace diplomacy must be climate sensitive, and our climate action must be conflict sensitive. Third, we must strengthen our partnerships within and beyond the UN system. We must partner closely with affected states and regional organizations and ensure the active participation of diverse groups, including women and youth. So, President, the national security communities in many countries have understood the security risks posed by climate change. While climate change can lead to hard security challenges, there are no hard security solutions. Our first line of defense is ambitious climate action. It must begin with the full implementation of the Paris Agreement and Agenda 2030. Climate action depends on multilateral cooperation, and we must invest in the ability of communities to adapt and respond to climate shocks and crises. This will reduce risks and in turn break the cycle of short-term responses, shifting to more sustainable solutions. We have a common responsibility to counter climate change and to maintain peace and security, especially for coming generations. I firmly believe that the UN Security Council will play an important role in these efforts. By doing so, the Council will be better prepared to maintain international peace and stability. So thank you.
For highlighting the very real impacts that we see all around us today, from our oceans to our forests, and the need to take a long-term sustainable approach. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Ralph Gonsalves, Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Prime Minister, you have the floor.
Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, St. Vincent and the Grenadines commends the United Kingdom for this opportunity to address climate-related security risks. We applaud your continued dedication and leadership in this matter, particularly ahead of COP26. I also thank the briefers for their insightful remarks on this vital subject. As the primary organ for maintaining peace and security, the Security Council has a responsibility to address the consequences of climate change in line with its mandate. Failure to tackle the debilitating aspects through the lens of peace and security means in part and abdication of our duty. As such, it is time for this Council to consider seriously a draft resolution on the matter and to map out a coherent approach aiming for a working consensus. We reaffirm that the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is the primary body dealing with climate change. And the Paris Agreement is a major component of our rules-based international system. At the same time, we recognize the United Nations Security Council, that it has a role to play without encroaching on the work of the inclusive decision-making body of the UNFCCC. Similarly, we must engage with the Peace-Building Commission and the General Assembly to address effectively climate and security risks across the joinder of issues touching and concerning humanitarian support, sustainable development, health pandemics, peace, and security. St. Vincent and the Grenadines reiterates that the first step to prevent or contain climate security risks is for the major and historical emitters to fulfill and indeed exceed the commitments made in the Paris Agreement. Global action must be accelerated to keep temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, in line with our common but differentiated responsibilities. Indeed, we have gathered around this virtual table those who can have the most impact in preventing climate-fueled conflict by rationally and comprehensively reducing emissions and by upholding financial commitments towards adaptation measures, separate and apart from already agreed official development aid obligations. Climate change is an existential challenge to us all, but it continues to affect disproportionately the most vulnerable among us, including small islands and conflict-affected countries. As a small island developing state, St. Vincent and the Grenadines knows all too well the impact of increasingly intense climatic shocks due to unique vulnerabilities and structural rigidities and fragilities. In our Caribbean region, it has become distressingly commonplace for an entire year's GDP to be washed away by a hurricane overnight, even as we are hindered by a lack of sufficient access on favorable terms to the global financial architecture. Our fellow islanders in low-lying states are faced with a clear and present existential threat, which poses significant concerns for sovereignty and, by extension, international peace. We stand in solidarity with conflict-affected countries where climate change exacerbates food insecurity and humanitarian crises, stokes conflicts over resources, fans the flames of political turmoil, and creates significant socioeconomic challenges. Our sister island, Haiti, is among the most susceptible to the impacts of increasingly intense and frequent climatic hazards. These natural disasters hit Haiti very hard, partly due to the felling of its forests, the misuse and abuse of woodland resources, and the requirement to pay externally imposed debts. Another awful example is the Sahel, which many of the speakers before me have addressed. We will not see an end to the complex cycles of conflict without striking at the heart of the battle for dwindling resources amidst climate change and drought. It is evident that among the major contemporary drivers of global insecurity is the bundle of issues arising from the impacts of climate change. Absolutely no country escapes the consequences attendant thereto. There are solutions to these man-made crises. In order to address effectively these complex situations, we must integrate climate perspectives into the Council's work. To this end, we support enhanced reporting by the Secretary General on the relevant issues, decision-making on the basis of climate risk data, the appointment of a special envoy on climate and security, further training of United Nations personnel to deal with the security implications of climate change, and the incorporation of climate advisors in peacekeeping missions. In crafting its mandates, the Security Council should also pay close attention to what the respective governments of conflict-affected areas outline as their principal climate security challenges and approaches, including in their nationally determined contributions and national adaptation plans. Further, the recent establishment of an informal expert group on climate and security, comprised of Security Council members, is a very promising development of which St. Vincent and Grenadines is proud to be a part. It is time for the Security Council to rise to the extant challenges associated with climate-related security risks in this, the 76th year of our United Nations. Climate change has rendered obsolete the traditional approaches to managing conflicts. Today, the UN Charter and the future of all humanity demand more of us. I think we will rise to the challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency, in particular for reinforcing the role and remit of the UN Security Council and your very practical series of policy recommendation measures. Can I now turn and give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Kaja Kallas, Prime Minister of Estonia. Prime Minister, you have the floor.
Thank you. Mr. President, Secretary General, distinguished briefers, dear colleagues. Let me start by thanking the United Kingdom for convening this meeting at such a high level. I hope that the world does not need any more convincing that climate change poses a real threat, including to our shared security. The world surely needs leaders to shape concrete actions, plans and targets and carry them through in order to fight the climate change. We warmly welcome the United States back to the Paris Climate Agreement and stand ready to cooperate in every possible way in this field. I am proud to say that the European Union is leading the way. Our commitment to reaching climate neutrality by 2050 will soon be written into law, and our every step will be geared towards meeting this goal. By 2050, we aim to achieve climate neutrality as a national target as well. Although critically important, this was not an easy decision to make, and not at least for Estonia, where energy production has traditionally relied on our national resource, oil shale, a fossil fuel. However, my government is firmly committed to contributing to global efforts. We have established a clear timeline for phasing out oil shale by 2040. The overlap between climate and security challenges was made painfully clear during a public discussion of this council last July. 7 out of the 10 countries most vulnerable and least prepared to deal with the climate change host a UN peacekeeping operation or a special political mission. The member states of the UN Security Council cannot ignore this nexus between climate and security any longer. Today, the German Foreign Minister, Mr. Heiko Maas, will present proposals by like-minded countries for the way forward in the UN Security Council. We fully support his message. We need to acknowledge that the Climate emergency can pose a danger to peace, and we must make it part of our security policy planning and discussions here. This Council must do more to fully understand climate-related security risks and integrate these knowledge into all aspects of its work. The Secretary General of the United Nations needs to receive a mandate to collect data and coordinate policy to the same. As always, we must not lose sight of the most vulnerable. We know how women and children suffer in conflicts, but the research confirms that women and girls are also disproportionately affected by climate change. We must help to empower women. We must direct resources to local women's groups at the front lines of climate change. We must recognize that women have an equal right to access, use and control land and resources. This is the way to build resilient communities, not only for women, but for everyone. Estonia has chosen to cooperate with some small islands and least developed countries in green technology solutions and know-how transfer. We have supported adaptation and emergency communication systems in the Pacific region, drinking water monitoring systems in the Grenada Island River Basin, and the development of solar energy solutions for rural areas in Myanmar. But in addition to individual projects, we need to have joint actions at the global level. The COVID-19 crisis has taught us that the emergencies do not respect borders. However, borders are quick to close, even for data. For an effective policy, we need more than just correct data. We also need to be able to share it and use it. And this means that data needs to be globally comparable, accessible, and interoperable, and we need political leadership. That is why Estonia has recently launched a new cooperation initiative. We are proposing the Data for the Environment Alliance, the DEAL. The DEAL will be a coalition of state and non-state actors who will support the United Nations Environment Program in developing a global environmental data strategy by 2025. It also aims to improve national data management capacities across the globe. I hope that everybody, including this Council, can see the value of high standard modern data management. I thank you all who have already shown interest. Dear colleagues, there is no doubt that climate change is making the world a more dangerous place. Who else than the UN Security Council needs to pay due attention to this and build the momentum before COP26? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for that invaluable contribution. And I will now turn and give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Simon Coveney, Minister for Foreign Affairs and Defence of Ireland. Simon, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Dominic. And let me start by congratulating you and the United Kingdom on your presidency of the Council and for hosting this very important debate at such a high level. I'd like also to thank Secretary General Guterres for his remarks and his leadership on this issue. And of course, I want to thank the briefer, Nisreen El-Saim, for her important testimony. Through a lifetime's work, David Attenborough has brought into our homes the wonder, but also the vulnerability of our planet's rich biodiversity, a common heritage, and we owe it to future generations to protect and preserve it. Climate change is the defining challenge of our generation. Unaddressed, it will impact every part of our planet. No aspect of our societies will be untouched. We need urgent and collective action by all pillars of the multilateral system, including this Council, if we are to meet this challenge. How we respond today will determine our shared future tomorrow, and we all have a role to play. Ireland, along with the rest of the EU, will not be found wanting. Ireland will transition to a net zero economy by 2050. My country, like all others, is already feeling the impact of climate change. We are taking mitigation actions, but these actions alone will not safeguard our future, and we know that. As Prime Minister Johnson has said, we must scale up our investments in adaptation and resilience if we are to protect the poorest and most vulnerable from the effects of climate change, especially in least developed countries and small island developing states. Countries like Ireland that have the means have a responsibility to act first. In doing so, we must consider the quality of our climate finance as we work to increase its quantity. In this regard, in the lead up to COP26 and beyond, we must listen to and be guided by the voices of those most affected by climate change, particularly those in least developed countries and in small island developing states. But we must also go beyond listening and promote the critical role of these countries in decision-making processes on climate. In this vein, we've been pleased to work closely with the UK on the Adaptation and Resilience Agenda through the Life AR initiative. This initiative, led by least developed countries, aims to sustainably increase the proportion of climate finance that reaches the local level for vital adaptation activities, from an estimated 10% today to 70% by 2030. Mr. President, urgent action is needed to combat the effects of climate change on our environment and on our complex global ecosystem. We look forward to the COP26 negotiations in Glasgow later this year, where we hope real progress can be made, building on the achievements of the Paris Climate Agreement. Climate change has many complex impacts, not least on international peace and security, the very business of this Council. This is the core of our debate today. It's clear that climate change is already causing upheaval, affecting people and security and stability of societies across the world. This is the testimony we hear daily from around the world, from small island states, from African partners, from regions affected by devastating forest fires or floods. We have seen in the Sahel, particularly in the countries around Lake Chad, how conflict and climate combine to diminish the availability of and access to natural resources. This amplifies tensions between farmers and others, which in turn causes and triggers violence. Across the Horn of Africa, the multiple and repeated shocks of drought and flooding undermine community resilience and livelihoods, creating drivers which armed groups exploit for influence and recruitment. This Council has mandated peacekeeping missions in 8 of the 15 countries most susceptible to climate risk. And if that doesn't send us a message, I'm not sure what will. Mr. President, the relationship between climate and security works in complex ways. Political instability undermines efforts to build climate resilience, and the impact of climatic shocks is compounded when institutions are strained or broken. We need to address these linkages between climate insecurity and peace as part of our conflict prevention and peace-building efforts and responsibilities on this Council. And we need to further build on our collective understanding of these linkages to enable us to take effective action. Ireland is proud to join the Weathering Risk Project to help guide our action on the Security Council and beyond. We're keen to understand better not just how climate change contributes to insecurity, but how climate action can build peace, and to use this understanding as we prioritise climate and security during our time on the Council. We're chairing the informal expert group of member states on this topic, together with Niger. This group provides a vital platform for sharing information on the why and how of climate action in the context of building and sustaining peace. We'll partner with Nauru and Germany as chairs of the group of Friends of Climate and Security. While the Council must take action, it's essential to work with the wider community of nations as we do so. Ireland's core message today is that the inclusion of climate in Security Council discussions and actions will strengthen conflict prevention and support peace-building efforts. Climate action alone, of course, will not deliver peace. We recognise that. But without climate action, we will have a less sustainable peace in many parts of the world. Ireland will take a practical and action-orientated approach. We recognise that our peacekeepers are already responding to climate-related crises. Where climate-related security risks exist, peacekeeping operations need to be underpinned by clear mandates and sufficient resources. We also recognise the gender dimensions of climate change, with women and girls most vulnerable to its effects. But they are also critical to our response to climate change, and we must ensure the full, equal and meaningful participation of women in decision-making processes related to climate issues and the management of natural resources. We must also engage deeply with young people who have shown solidarity and extraordinary leadership at times on climate change on a global scale. But in listening to and understanding the concerns and insights of future generations, we can't abrogate our responsibility to provide leadership today. The world's response to the climate emergency can also be a cause for hope, which is needed right now. The vast majority of UN member states wish to work together to ensure that we address one of the greatest challenges humanity has ever faced. We can and must work in a way that addresses the threats of global peace and security, from climate change, enhancing global cooperation as we do so. Climate change challenges all of humanity, but I'm optimistic, and drawing from the words of James Joyce, I am tomorrow or some future day what I established today. Starting afresh today, let's work together. This is an important year for climate action, particularly in the build-up to COP26. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Thank you, Simon, for that important contribution and the combination of challenge, but also hope and optimism that this year can shift the dial on climate change. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Marcelo Ebrard Casaubon, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Mexico. Marcelo, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Dominic. Gracias. México agradece al primer ministro del Reino Unido, a Boris Johnson, por habernos convocado a este debate sobre los efectos del cambio climático, sobre la paz y la seguridad internacionales. La pandemia del COVID-19 nos revela que la seguridad internacional ya no puede ser entendida solo bajo la óptica de las amenazas tradicionales. Las amenazas son multidimensionales y están vinculadas a retos en materia de desarrollo económico y social. Toca a este Consejo de Seguridad responder oportunamente a los retos actuales para el mantenimiento de la paz. El secretario general de la ONU nos recuerda reiteradamente que los incendios, inundaciones y otros eventos climáticos extremos han empeorado en todas las regiones del mundo y que ha aumentado el riesgo de una posible catástrofe que supondría un incremento en la temperatura global de más de 3 grados. La situación de inseguridad alimentaria, la escasez de agua, las sequías o las inundaciones ha alcanzado niveles alarmantes en varias regiones del mundo, pero sobre todo impacta a aquellas comunidades que se encuentran inmersas en conflictos y de manera especial impacta a las mujeres. El cambio climático debe ser atendido de manera multilateral, con un enfoque integral y coherente a través de todo el sistema de Naciones Unidas. México no escatimará esfuerzos para lograr que la próxima conferencia de las partes de la Convención Marco sobre el Cambio Climático a celebrarse en Glasgow sea un éxito y pueda delinear las acciones tendientes a una recuperación sostenible post-pandemia. Reconocemos el retorno de los Estados Unidos de América al Acuerdo de París y su compromiso renovado con una vía eficaz en la que México siempre ha creído, el multilateralismo. El cambio climático requiere una respuesta internacional coordinada con énfasis en la conservación de los ecosistemas y el apoyo en los compromisos de mitigación y de adaptación. En ese sentido, México acaba de presentar la actualización de su contribución nacionalmente determinada para cumplir con nuestros compromisos del Acuerdo de París. Como parte de la Comisión Global de Adaptación, México impulsa las soluciones basadas en la naturaleza, por ejemplo, la infraestructura sostenible que ofrece la recuperación, resiliencia e inversión para disminuir desigualdades económicas y sociales. México promueve un equilibrio entre los recursos financieros, la atención política y los esfuerzos que se dedican a la adaptación en complemento de aquellos que se dirigen solo hacia la mitigación. Para México, la adaptación es un tema de interés prioritario, dada la urgencia de fortalecer a las comunidades y a quienes son más vulnerables para enfrentar los impactos del cambio climático. En ese sentido, la prevención es una parte fundamental de nuestra política en materia de gestión integral del riesgo. Asimismo, México considera que la implementación del marco de Sendai debe apuntalar y generar sinergias y coherencia con las acciones emprendidas en el marco de la Agenda 2030 y la Agenda de Acción de Addis Abeba, entre otros procesos multilaterales. Analizar con rigor los principales riesgos y su entorno específico permitiría al Consejo de Seguridad identificar oportunamente situaciones y espacios en los cuales los efectos del cambio climático pueden tener efectos multiplicadores que afecten la paz y seguridad internacionales. Ello haría posible, a su vez, tomar acciones preventivas para evitar o mitigar catástrofes humanitarias. El establecimiento del grupo informal del Consejo para dar seguimiento al vínculo entre el cambio climático y la seguridad resulta, pues, oportuno y bienvenido. Este grupo, con el apoyo de los análisis realizados por el mecanismo de colaboración en el Departamento de Asuntos Políticos y Consolidación de la Paz, son el tipo de medidas concretas que nos ayudarán a fortalecer las capacidades que necesita el sistema. La actual pandemia por COVID-19 y sus efectos, sobre todo en los contextos más frágiles, ha demostrado lo apremiante que es proteger a las personas, a sus medios de subsistencia y garantizar la construcción de la paz sostenible. Coincidimos con el secretario general. La recuperación post-pandemia es una oportunidad para reconstruir mejor y debemos implementar un cambio transformador. Por ello, México reafirma su compromiso para combatir el cambio climático como una prioridad y reitera su voluntad de trabajar conjuntamente para encontrar soluciones globales, multidimensionales y estructurales a las problemáticas ambientales para construir sociedades más igualitarias, más sostenibles y más resilientes. Muchas gracias.
Marcelo, thank you very much for the important focus on multilateral efforts and your support for COP26. May I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Emmanuel Macron, President of France. Mr. President, you have the floor.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Ministre. Mesdames, Messieurs les Présidents, Mesdames, Messieurs les Premiers Ministres, Monsieur le Secrétaire Général des Nations Unies, Mesdames, Messieurs et chers amis, je tiens d'abord à remercier le Premier ministre Boris Johnson et le Royaume-Uni d'organiser avec le Secrétaire Général cette réunion et de nous accueillir pour la COP26 à Glasgow cette année. Je pense qu'on a tous clairement en tête l'importance de cet agenda, alors même que dans quelques semaines, les États-Unis d'Amérique organiseront un sommet important le 22 avril et je salue John Kerry, que j'aperçois à l'écran, qui fut sur les fonds baptismaux de l'accord de Paris et, si je puis dire, un résistant durant les 4 années qui viennent de s'écouler. Et donc nous sommes tous heureux de retrouver pleinement les États-Unis d'Amérique autour de la table. J'ai 3 messages tout simples à partager avec vous qui sont en ligne avec tout ce qui vient d'être dit. Le premier, c'est que très clairement, nous avons pu établir ces dernières années que la lutte contre le changement climatique et pour la protection de l'environnement est clairement une question de paix et de sécurité à part entière. Je ne reviens pas sur tout l'agenda de suivi des accords de Paris et ce que nous discuterons sans doute en virtuel le 22 avril, puis à Glasgow, et les objectifs qui sont les nôtres à l'égard des générations actuelles et futures. Mais très clairement, le lien entre climat et sécurité, s'il est complexe, est indéniable, en quelque sorte inexorable. Et au-delà même de ce qui peut être écrit, sur les 20 pays les plus touchés par les conflits dans le monde, 12 font également partie des pays les plus vulnérables aux impacts des changements climatiques. Dans le Pacifique, à défaut d'action résolue d'adaptation, les habitants de certaines îles n'auront d'autre choix que de quitter leur terre. Et nous avons appris ces dernières années combien les conséquences des désertifications, de la réduction des réserves halieutiques, comme des possibilités d'établir des cultures stables, conduisaient à des conflits. La zone du lac Tchad en est la parfaite illustration, qui a subi des migrations et une large partie de la conflictualité, au-delà du fait terroriste islamiste, a été nourrie par des migrations forcées par le changement climatique. Il en est de même du succès de Boko Haram dans la région et du changement d'usage de certaines terres dans le nord-est nigérian. Et donc très clairement, nous voyons les conséquences dans toutes ces zones d'un agenda climatique non maîtrisé sur l'insécurité et en quelque sorte sur la naissance de nouveaux conflits, mais aussi sur un agenda, et je sais combien il tient à cœur à notre secrétaire général Antonio Guterres, celui des déplacements de population, des migrations subies et donc des réfugiés. Les réfugiés climatiques sont de plus en plus nombreux. Les réfugiés climatiques sont en train aujourd'hui de devenir les premières cibles de la pandémie et de la crise alimentaire. Et nous voyons bien, en quelque sorte, le cumul de tous ces agendas. Et très clairement, un échec sur le front du climat s'après les efforts de prévention des conflits et de consolidation de la paix. C'est pourquoi je soutiens totalement l'initiative de saisir ces enjeux au niveau du Conseil de sécurité dans le cadre de son mandat de maintien de la paix et de la sécurité internationale. L'action du Conseil doit être guidée par la nécessité d'atténuer les effets du changement climatique sur les populations et ses conséquences sur le développement des conflits. Cette action doit être conduite dans le cadre d'une diplomatie climatique multilatérale efficace et en nous dotant aussi d'une palette d'outils à disposition. Après un événement climatique extrême, il faudra des mesures d'urgence qui sont humanitaires pour sauver des vies, assurer la sécurité, fournir aussi des moyens d'une reconstruction durable. Et dans d'autres cas, il faudra aider des communautés à s'adapter face à la montée inéluctable des eaux, la dégradation des sols. Il faudra aussi anticiper en dotant, par exemple, les petits producteurs de mécanismes d'assurance pour leur permettre de redémarrer une activité économique. Et donc, on le voit bien, c'est un agenda à structurer, un agenda de prévention et d'efficacité qui justifie, d'une part, qu'il soit saisi au niveau du Conseil de sécurité, d'autre part, qui justifie pleinement que nous puissions soutenir la nomination d'un ou d'une envoyée spéciale pour la sécurité climatique pour coordonner tous ces efforts. Je ne verrai que des avantages à ce que le secrétaire général fasse rapport chaque année au Conseil de sécurité sur l'impact du climat sur la sécurité internationale pour anticiper, alerter, faire de recommandations et nous permettre de jouer notre rôle. Deuxième remarque, c'est que face à ce multiplicateur de menaces, il nous faut agir efficacement, prendre nos responsabilités, chacune et chacun, et en particulier dans trois régions qui me semblent tout spécifiquement vulnérables, et où l'agenda multilatéral doit s'articuler avec l'agenda régional et prendre une forme sans doute plus adaptée. Nous le savons, les conséquences du changement climatique sont injustement réparties, et nous devons prendre en compte évidemment ceci dans nos engagements. Il y a un mois, j'ai plaidé pour que la part de la France justement dans la finance climat dédiée à l'adaptation augmente. La France consacrera 2 milliards d'euros par an, soit un tiers de la finance climat à l'adaptation. Et l'accent doit être particulièrement mis sur plusieurs zones. D'abord l'Afrique. Très clairement, c'est en Afrique, les deux exemples que je citais tout à l'heure le montraient, que nous avons les conséquences parmi les plus criantes de ce lien climat-sécurité. Le 11 janvier dernier, à l'occasion du One Planet Summit dédié à la biodiversité, nous avons lancé un accélérateur de la Grande Muraille Verte. La Grande Muraille Verte est une initiative qui existe depuis plus de 10 ans aujourd'hui, qui regroupe 11 États du Sahel, et je salue tous mes amis sahéliens que j'aperçois ici aussi, 11 États du Sahel, avec un objectif de restaurer 250 millions d'hectares de terre pour l'agriculture et de créer 10 millions d'emplois, tout en séquestrant 250 millions de tonnes de carbone, ce qui serait une contribution remarquable de l'Afrique aussi à la lutte contre le réchauffement climatique. Sur cet agenda-là, nous avons décidé de réinvestir, de remettre de la gouvernance, et nous le savons bien, compte tenu de ce que vivent les pays du Sahel aujourd'hui face à la menace terroriste, nous avons, en accélérant nos réponses pour la biodiversité et contre le réchauffement climatique dans le Sahel, un instrument très concret de la lutte pour le climat et pour la paix, complètement joint. Et c'est exactement le même esprit en Afrique qui a animé toutes les initiatives qui ont été prises pour la forêt tropicale. Je vois la première ministre de Norvège qui est ici et qui a, à côté de la chancelière Merkel, joué un rôle fondateur dans cette initiative qui doit continuer de nous animer. Et je pense que c'est exactement cet esprit que nous devons structurer. Et à cet égard, je pense qu'un dialogue accru entre l'Union africaine et les Nations unies serait extrêmement propice à mieux structurer ces instruments et articuler ce débat. C'est exactement la même méthodologie, il me semble, que nous devons retenir au niveau de l'Indo-Pacifique. Nous avons aujourd'hui dans la région Indo-Pacifique, donc Pacifique-Océanie, énormément d'États vulnérables. Nous le savons, des États-nations qui aujourd'hui auront énormément de mal à s'adapter si nous ne brisons pas le cours du réchauffement et des dérèglements climatiques. Les réponses sont à apporter qui sont des conditions à la paix et la stabilité de toute cette région. Et nous devons les apporter dans un cadre multilatéral, sinon l'anxiété climatique, les troubles climatiques viendront durcir une situation géopolitique que nous connaissons et seront en quelque sorte les instruments d'une diplomatie de l'adaptation climatique qui créera les guerres des prochaines années, en proposant des repeuplements, en proposant des aménagements à la main de l'un ou l'autre grand État souverain de la région. Troisième point, c'est l'agenda dans l'Arctique, qui sera l'un des enjeux majeurs des prochaines années et qui sera là aussi un enjeu climatique et géopolitique, mariant les réponses qui devront être les nôtres pour prévenir, accompagner le réchauffement qui est aujourd'hui à l'œuvre et éviter les tensions géopolitiques qui sont en train de naître dans cette région. Je voulais insister sur ces trois régions qui sont des théâtres très concrets d'une plus grande réimplication de la communauté internationale et du besoin de Nations Unies et d'un agenda multilatéral pour éviter des conflictualités nouvelles. Enfin, la bataille contre les fléaux du XXIe siècle doit aussi être le ferment d'une unité retrouvée du Conseil de sécurité. La pandémie nous a montré la réconciliation de la lutte pour la santé mondiale, pour la biodiversité et pour la lutte contre le dérèglement climatique. Je crois qu'il en est de même en y adjoignant les sujets de paix et de sécurité. Nous sommes de plus en plus en train de réunifier ces agendas autour de la protection de l'humain et de créer aussi les voies et moyens d'une reconsolidation en quelque sorte d'un multilatéralisme efficace et d'une nécessité pour les membres permanents comme pour l'ensemble des membres du Conseil de sécurité de coopérer sur cet agenda concret pour les prochaines années, car il en va non pas de conflits régionaux dont on pourrait accepter qu'ils se dégradent, encore que je pense qu'on ne devrait jamais s'y résoudre, mais il en va de notre santé, de nos vies, de la stabilité de notre planète. Voilà les trois remarques que je voulais partager avec vous, avec une conviction, c'est que le rôle des Nations Unies et du Conseil sont sur ce sujet sans doute encore plus important aujourd'hui qu'hier et que nous sommes face à une accélération des temps qui, au fond, unifie ces agendas. Et je voulais simplement vous dire combien la France, à vos côtés, y serait profondément engagée.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency, Mr. President, for that far-reaching contribution and your three specific focal points as well. May I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Prakash Javadekar, Minister for the Environment, Forests and Climate Change of India. Minister, you have the floor.
Thank you, Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom, Mr. Dominic Raab. Excellencies, I would like to begin my statement with a short hymn from our philosophy, which is there in Shukla Yajurveda. Dauhum Shanti, Antariksham Shanti, Prithvi Shanti, Apa Shanti, Aushadhaya Shanti, Vanaspatiya Shanti, Vishwadeva Shanti, Brahmam Shanti. This means let there be balance in space, the sky, the earth, the water. Let there be growth in plants, in the trees. Let there be grace in God and bliss in the soul. Let there be balance in everything. And let such peace be with every one of us. From this Vedic message, it is very clear that environment belongs to all living beings. So it needs protection by all and for the welfare of all. Climate change is a defining issue of our time. Without drastic actions by us collectively, adapting to its impacts in the future may well be impossible, but definitely will not be more impossible, but definitely more difficult and costlier. The global community has addressed the issue of climate change through various mechanisms, central to which is the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement negotiated under this framework. Together they present a delicately balanced global democratic effort to take climate action in a nationally determined manner based on certain fundamental agreed principles, the foremost among which is common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities, and which must underline all future discussions on climate change. Therefore, before we start discussing the issue of securitization of climate, we need to ensure that we are not building a parallel climate track where these mechanisms and principles are brushed aside or not duly considered. Mr. President, the 2019 IPCC Special Report Climate Change and the Land says that extreme weather and climatic or slow onset events may lead to increased displacements, disrupted food chains, threatened livelihoods, and could contribute to exacerbated stresses for conflict. Even the best science available claims that climate change only exacerbates conflict and is not a reason for conflict and does not threaten peace and security. There is no common, widely accepted methodology for assessing the links between climate change, conflict, and fragility. Fragility and climate impact are highly context-specific. In addition, both peace and conflict assessments, as well as vulnerability assessments, face significant challenges when it comes to the data availability, as was mentioned earlier, and impact measurement. Mr. President, in number of fragile contexts where governments are struggling to provide basic services due to capacity and legitimacy issues, instances of chronic emergency conditions and famine risks are largely driven by continued political violence, disrupting harvests and aid supplies rather than by climate factors alone. This underscores the idea that a complete picture of climate vulnerability only emerges with an assessment of states' capacity to be the primary responder to interrelated environmental, social, economic, and security dynamics. The nationally determined contributions are largely about mitigation commitments and adaptation requirements that collectively determine whether the countries will achieve the Paris goal of limiting the global average temperature increase to well below 2 degrees. Parties are nowhere required to communicate on climate-related security risk in their NDCs. Moreover, an in-depth analysis of the NDCs submitted in the first round has shown that member states see climate change as a risk to the well-being of their citizens and to some degree their economies, but never as a risk to social stability, national sovereignty, or the functioning of the state. Of the 16 countries that have submitted their updated NDCs to the UNFCCC Secretariat by October 2020, none have framed climate change as risk to peace and stability. The idea of climate change and actions should not be to move the climate ambition goal post-2050. It is important for countries to fulfill their pre-2020 commitment. That is the beginning. Climate action needs to go hand in hand with the framework for financial, technical, and capacity building support to countries that need it. While climate change does not directly or inherently cause violent conflict, its interaction with other social, political, and economic factors can nonetheless exacerbate drivers of conflict and fragility and have negative impacts on peace, stability, and security. It is for precisely this reason that developing country NDCs included information on adaptation activities and the need for finance, technology development and transfer, capacity building and transparency. However, while the commitment by developed countries to jointly mobilize $100 billion per year by 2020 in support of climate action in developing countries has been central to the climate accords since 2009, the delivery on this commitment has been elusive. Mr. President, the impacts of climate change and its associated security risks have important gender dimensions. Women and girls experience the interplay between climate change and the peace and security in direct and profound ways. Since women are often providers of the food, water, and energy for their families, they are likely to face increased challenges in accessing resources due to climate change. As the primary caregivers, women are often living on the front lines of climate change and has distinct knowledge and experience to contribute to building effective adaptation strategies. There is an urgent need to promote and support the meaningful participation of women and marginalized groups in the national level climate change policy and planning processes. Mr. President, India has taken significant steps to fight climate change, and we have delivered on our commitments. Our mitigation strategies have emphasized on clean and efficient energy systems, safe, smart, and sustainable green mass urban transport network, planned afforestation, integrating green thinking across all production and consumption sectors. India is only country on track among the G20 nations to meet its climate change mitigation commitments. We are not only meeting our Paris Agreement's targets, but will exceed them. India currently has the fastest growing solar energy program in the world. We have expanded access to clean cooking fuel to over 80 million households. This is among the largest clean energy drives globally. Our recent commitment of installing 450 gigawatts of renewable energy, elimination of single-use plastic, 100% railway electrification, and creation of an additional carbon sink by restoring 26 million hectares of degraded land, among other measures, have only added to our climate ambitions. India strongly believes that the only way to generate persistent, long-term, and positive action in the climate change domain is through partnerships by undertaking collective action to make a lasting and sustainable impact. The International Solar Alliance and the Coalition for Disaster Resilience Infrastructure are two such initiatives by India that have been launched to addressing the challenges of climate change and adaptation. Mr. President, there is a significant opportunity for countries to integrate low carbon development in their COVID-19 rescue and recovery measures and long-term mitigation strategies that are scheduled to be announced for the reconvened 26th session of COP in 2021. To better integrate climate change adaptation and peace building, we would suggest the building of robust governance structure at the local, national, and regional levels to address climate and fragility-related risks. This not only improves public perception of government legitimacy, but also shores up capacity of states to address climate risks before they become fragile. Donor countries should provide greater financial, technological, and capacity-building assistance to help fragile states to put in place necessary adaptation and mitigation strategies to combat the impact of climate change. Mahatma Gandhi once said that there is enough for everybody's need, but not for everybody's greed. Let us then make the transition to a more climate-friendly lifestyle by adapting to a low-carbon development pathway based on our needs and not on our greed. Let us view climate change as a wake-up call and an opportunity to strengthen multilateralism and seek equitable and inclusive solutions to live a greener, cleaner, and sustainable world for our future generations. Sarve bhavantu sukhina, sarve santu niramaya, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, ma kaschid dukkha bhag bhavet. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Means, may all sentinel beings be at peace. May no one suffer from illness. May all see what is auspicious. May no one suffer. Please, peace, peace, peace. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for that powerful contribution and amongst the many different things you're doing for India's efforts on solar and disaster relief. I now turn to give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. John Kerry, US Special Presidential Envoy for Climate. Mr. Kerry, you have the floor.
Mr. President, thank you very much. Foreign Secretary Raab, great to see you, and thank you to Prime Minister Johnson for convening this essential discussion, and of course for your leadership and partnership as we all prepare for COP26. Also want to thank Secretary General Antonio Guterres for sounding the alarm on the climate crisis every chance that he gets. And Monsieur le Président Macron and Prime Minister Solberg, thank you for the incredible leadership of Europe during what can only be deemed by many of us as an inexcusable absence by our country from this debate. We're grateful for Europe stepping up. I'm really pleased to have the privilege of speaking before the Security Council today, and I thank all of my colleagues, those who have contributed, and my counterpart in India, Mr. Javadekar, thank you for your important reminder of the larger issues that are at stake here. I think it's particularly important we are before the Security Council because the climate crisis is indisputably a Security Council issue. Our Pentagon has for years described the impact of climate as a threat multiplier. In fact, it is among the most complex and compelling security issues that I think we've ever faced. We're told repeatedly that it is an existential threat. And yet, despite impacts that can exacerbate existing political, social, and economic tensions, we honestly have yet as a world to respond with the urgency required. When farmers, and others have mentioned this, can no longer make a living because the weather is so extreme and unpredictable, they become increasingly desperate. When people already impoverished lose water and the heat drives them from their homes as it is, the embers of conflict burn brighter and faster. Studies warn us that hundreds of millions of people could be uprooted. Not only can mass migration drive humanitarian crisis, but we also know that if it's not managed well, it undermines peace and stability. So it is vital to discuss this issue here in the UN Security Council. Because when we talk about the climate crisis, we are talking about our security, every nation, every citizen, economic security, food security, energy security, and yes, even physical security. The evidence, the science, is screaming at us. But just as humans have made the choices that brought us here, we can make the choices that take us to a better place. We can build resilience. We can even adapt to many of the projected impacts. The sad reality is that if you look at a map of the most fragile states in the world, and you overlay that with a map of those most vulnerable to devastating climate impacts, you can see exactly how much overlap there is. Many of the regions where we're focused on peace building and conflict prevention are projected to be the literal hotspots in the coming crisis. And we know, as Ms. El-Salim powerfully described, that conflict and the climate crisis are linked in places like Sudan and so many others. We simply cannot ignore how climate is affecting these regions. On the contrary, climate impacts need to be reflected in every aspect of this body's decision-making and field reporting. The good news is that even as we work to build resilience around the world and adapt to the climate consequences that are already inevitable, it is still possible to stave off the very worst impacts of the crisis. President Biden knows that we don't have a moment to waste, which is why he moved to rejoin the Paris Agreement just hours after being sworn into office. And it is why he has directed a coordinated, whole-of-government approach to address the climate crisis, to elevate the issue as a national security priority, and to put America on an irreversible path to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 or earlier. And I emphasize irreversible by any president, by any demagogue of the future. But no one country can solve the climate crisis on its own. It is exactly the kind of challenge the United Nations was created to address. We will all have to work together, just as we did in Paris, to set bold and achievable targets and clear roadmaps for how we will reach them. It is not enough to have some outlying 30-year from now target and pretend that we've done our job. Every country will have to step up and raise ambition. And the fact is that the 17 major emitters of the world bear responsibility to the rest of the world to reduce their emissions. And that begins by reducing the use of coal on a global basis. Nothing less than bold action in this decade can set the entire world on a path that we have confidence will get to net zero emissions by 2050 or earlier. And that is the only way science tells us we can keep alive the possibility of limiting this planet's warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Why is that so critical? Because overwhelming evidence tells us that anything more will have catastrophic implications around the globe. And for those who argue that climate action is just too expensive, study after study confirms that now, at this moment in our history, inaction comes with a far higher price tag than action. Unlike most security threats, addressing the climate crisis actually presents the greatest economic opportunity in modern history. Not since the Industrial Revolution has there been such potential to build back better in every corner of the world. And sadly, not doing so will leave us in a position where we are, just by inadvertence, by lack of will, by lack of coming together, marching forward in what is almost tantamount to a mutual suicide pact. The Leaders' Summit that President Biden will host on Earth Day will be a critical moment to advance our shared goals. And we're planning on taking advantage of every opportunity we have in the coming months to work, all of us, together in addressing the many facets of this crisis. And in November, we will join with the rest of the world to convene in Glasgow for the UN Climate Conference, COP26. I am convinced it is literally our last best hope to get on track and to get this right. In the meantime, here in the United Nations Security Council, the United States will work closely with our like-minded colleagues to focus the Security Council's attention on the climate crisis and its consequences on international peace and security. In that vein, we congratulate Ireland in assuming the co-chairmanship with Niger of the informal expert group on climate and security. We are eager to engage with the IEG and advance its goals. My friends, given the journey that many of us have been on since Rio in 1992, we are now compelled to do more than talk about climate-related security risks. We have to work together to understand them before they wreak havoc. We have to develop stronger early warning systems. We have to mainstream the climate crisis into every aspect of our public and private sector and decision-making. And in the face of climate-fueled challenges, we have to make certain that cooperation, not conflict, is the response of first resort. Some argue that climate change isn't the business of the UN Security Council. Well, we could only wish that that were true. But the fact is, the climate threat is so massive, so multifaceted, that it's impossible to disentangle it from other challenges that the Security Council faces. We bury our heads in the sand at our own peril. It is time to start treating the climate crisis like the urgent security threat that it is. This is literally the challenge of all of our generations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency, for that powerful contribution. Great to have you and the US back in the Paris Agreement. Now may I give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Xi A. Zhenhua, China Special Envoy for Climate Change. Sir, you have the floor.
主席先生、秘书长先生、各位阁下，中方欢迎约翰逊首相召集此次会议，感谢古特雷斯秘书长所做的致辞和通报。气候变化已经对人类的生存、发展与安全，已经是对人类生存、发展与安全现实、紧迫而严峻的挑战。2015年达成的巴黎协定是全球气候治理的里程碑，奠定了国际社会2020年后加强应对气候变化行动与国际合作的制度安排。当前，全球气候治理进入了全面落实巴黎协定的关键阶段，但新冠肺炎的疫情进一步的蔓延，对全球应对气候变化的努力构成了严峻的挑战。中方希望国际社会进一步加强团结，共同把握应对气候变化的正确方向。在此呢，我愿提出几点建议。第一，坚定地落实国际共识，全球气候治理的进程仍然任重道远，主要任务是全面有效地落实巴黎协定，确保目标的实现，共同应对全球气候变化的挑战。发达国家和发展中国家的历史责任、发展阶段、应对能力不同，要恪守共同但有区别的责任，公平、各自能力的原则，尊重并支持各国根据国情确定国家自主贡献的目标，不搞一刀切。发达国家要履行率先减排的义务，并切实地兑现承诺，提供更加有力的资金和技术支持，帮助发展中国家提升应对气候变化的能力。发展中国家也要尽其所能采取积极的气候行动。第二，积极推进绿色复苏。新冠疫情爆发和蔓延再次警示人类更加重视尊重自然、顺应自然。后疫情时代，各国要开展经济重建，不能重复过去只讲索取、不讲投入，只讲发展、不讲保护，只讲利润、不讲修复的老路。要大力的推动新能源、绿色环保等产业的发展，坚持绿色低碳转型的大方向，不断的创新。要努力的构建尊重自然的生态系统，保护全球生物多样性，打造更加牢固的全球生态安全屏障。要倡导绿色环保的生活方式，促进自然和谐共处。第三，大力推动可持续发展。气候变化问题归根到底是发展问题，可持续发展是解决一切问题的总开关，也是消除冲突根源的金钥匙。国际社会要帮助冲突地区的国家、最不发达国家、小岛屿发展中国家加强发展能力的建设，要鼓励各国把应对气候变化融入国家经济社会发展的规划，通过多种手段全力的推进各项工作，实现发展经济、消除贫困、促进就业、保障健康、 保护生态环境与应对气候变化协同发展。第四，始终坚持多边主义。在气候变化的挑战面前，人类是命运共同体。国际社会要继续以联合国气候变化框架公约为主渠道，在公约和巴黎协定的框架下推进应对气候变化的合作。公约秘书处、联合国发展系统以及驻地协调员应根据各自的授权，积极地回应有关国家应对气候变化和经济社会发展的需要，有针对性地提供支持。安理会在应对气候变化问题上发挥作用，应符合自身的职责。主席先生、秘书长先生，中国不仅是达成巴黎协定的重要贡献者，也是落实巴黎协定的积极践行者。我们坚持责任担当。去年9月，习近平主席宣布，中国将力争2030年前二氧化碳的排放达到峰值，努力争取2060年前实现碳中和，赢得了国际社会广泛的赞誉。12月，气候雄心峰会上，习近平主席进一步宣布，中国提高国家自主贡献的一系列的新举措，从碳达峰到碳中和，发达国家大体上需要50至60年的时间，而中国将付出艰苦卓绝的努力，力争30年实现。这体现了中国应对气候变化的力度和雄心。我们秉持绿色发展，2020年中国的碳强度较自主贡献目标基准年2050年降低了48.4%。截至2019年底，中国非化石能源占一次能源消费的比重达到了15.3%，提前完成了2020年承诺的目标。截至目前，中国的森林蓄积量连续30年保持增长，比2005年增加了超过45亿立方米，已经超额完成2020年的目标。中国已经成为新能源汽车保有量最多的国家，可再生能源领域专利数、投资、装机和发电量已连续多年稳居世界第一，风电、光伏装机的规模均占世界30%以上。我们奉行合作共赢，中国同联合国环境规划署共同发起成立了“一带一路”绿色发展国际联盟，帮助沿线国家建设水电、风能、光伏等可再生能源项目。中国同其他发展中国家在南南合作的框架下建设低碳示范区，实施减缓和适应气候变化的项目，推动各国实现绿色发展。今年，中国将承办生物多样性公约第15次缔约国大会，期待从各方商讨2020年后全球生物多样性治理的新战略。主席先生、秘书长先生，我们将坚信，只要各国携手努力，共同推动巴黎协定全面有效的实施，推动构建合作共赢、公平合理的气候治理体系，推动实现可持续发展，就一定能够建成持续和平、普遍安全、共同繁荣、开放包容、清洁美丽的美好星球。谢谢。
Thank you, Your Excellency, and for that wide-ranging contribution and your explanation of China's ambition with its nationally determined contribution. Can I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation? You have the floor, Your Excellency.
Благодарю вас, господин председатель. Мы признательны генеральному секретарю Гутеррешу и госпоже Исаим за их брифинг. Изменение климата является одним из современных глобальных вызовов, с которыми сталкивается человечество. Преодоление его негативных последствий требует скоординированных и комплексных подходов со стороны международного сообщества, направленных не только на сокращение выбросов парниковых газов, но и на внедрение эффективных мер в области адаптации. Соответствующая работа, в том числе экспертная, активно ведется на профильных площадках в рамках системы ООН, в первую очередь по линии рамочной Конвенции ООН об изменении климата и является составной частью общих усилий в интересах достижения устойчивого развития. Мы приветствуем решение Соединенных Штатов о возвращении в Парижское соглашение по климату. Господин председатель, Совет Безопасности уже неоднократно обсуждал проблему изменения климата в контексте ее влияния на международный мир и безопасность. На повестку дня выносились примеры ряда стран и отдельных регионов, в первую очередь на африканском континенте, где изменение климата и стихийные бедствия представлялись как основная угроза стабильности, как первопричина проблем. Нам также указывали на возрастающие риски возникновения конфликтов, проецируя такие сценарии на глобальный контекст. Мы согласны с тем, что климатические изменения и экологические проблемы могут усугублять конфликты. Но являются ли они их первопричиной? В этом есть большие сомнения. Во-первых, связь климата с конфликтами можно рассматривать только применительно к отдельным странам и регионам. Говорить об этом генерически и в глобальном контексте не обоснованно. А навязывать автоматизм такой взаимосвязи даже опасно. К тому же далеко не все конфликты тождественны угрозам международному миру и безопасности, рассматриваемым Советом. Во-вторых, считать климат первопричиной проблем безопасности уводить дело от реальных первопричин, а значит идти по ложному следу в поисках решения этих проблем. В-третьих, нельзя замалчивать другие основополагающие факторы, которые в не меньшей, а точнее в большей степени способствуют нарастанию рисков. Имея в виду политические и социально-экономические условия в конкретных странах и регионах, которые на сегодняшний день усугубились проблемой пандемии коронавируса. Болезнь значительно обострила неравенство между государствами и внутри них, спровоцировала всплеск нищеты и голода, особенно в странах, находящихся в состоянии конфликта. Обостряют эти проблемы и незаконные односторонние ограничительные меры, очевидный вред которых те, кто их вводит, предпочитает игнорировать. Делая акцент на климатической теме, страны-доноры зачастую уклоняются от дискуссии про комплексный характер вызовов устойчивому развитию. Среди них, в частности, отказ от обмена технологиями и зеленый протекционизм. Не лучше ли странам-донорам сосредоточиться на соблюдении уже согласованных финансовых обязательств и обеспечении доступа к наилучшим технологиям в области повышения устойчивости и адаптации, а также содействии в реализации образовательных проектов в сфере климата. В этом и заключается превентивный подход на основе сбалансированного учета 3 измерений повестки 2030. Да, обсуждение климатической проблематики в Совете Безопасности смотрится как бы выигрышно и политически весомо. Но реальную работу над повышением координации международной деятельности на этом направлении целесообразно вести на профильных площадках, таких как Генеральная Ассамблея ООН, ИКСОС, Система развития ООН и, конечно же, Рамочная конвенция ООН об изменении климата. Возвращаясь к проблеме изменения климата в контексте международного мира и безопасности, нельзя не упомянуть и тезис о том, что конфликты сами по себе снижают возможности государств по повышению устойчивости и адаптации к негативным последствиям изменения климата, отвлекая и без того ограниченные ресурсы. В последнее время в качестве показательного примера региона, в котором изменение климата непосредственно влияет на стабильность, приводится Сахель. Однако нельзя забывать о причинах, которые привели к резкому обострению рисков в области безопасности там. Среди них волюнтаристские действия ряда стран, приведшие к смене режима в Ливии, последствия для экологии ракетно-бомбовых ударов НАТО, в том числе по объектам нефтяной инфраструктуры. Это пример того, как экология приносится в жертву геополитики. Таких примеров мы могли бы привести много. Господин председатель, Российская Федерация разделяет необходимость неотложного реагирования на изменение климата. Но делать это надо в рамках тех механизмов, где этим занимаются профессионально. Важно сосредоточиться на эффективной реализации согласованных на международном уровне обязательств в рамках Парижского соглашения, постепенно повышая их амбициозность. Одновременно необходимо не ослаблять глобальные и национальные усилия на широком фронте борьбы с социально-экономическими проблемами в интересах достижения устойчивого развития, в том числе в контексте восстановления после пандемии. Благодарю вас.
Thank you very much, representative of the Russian Federation. Can I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Lazarus McCarthy Chakwera, President of President of Malawi. Mr. President, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Mr. President, thank you for ably representing the Right Honorable Prime Minister and Chair of COP26, Mr. Boris Johnson. Mr. Secretary General, members of the Steering Committee, and Excellencies and colleagues, it's an honor to address you on behalf of the least developed countries. And so let me begin by thanking the Right Honorable Boris Johnson for inviting us to these deliberations. For us as LDCs, building resilience to mitigate security risks must begin with reflections on the COVID-19 pandemic. Not only has it exacerbated those risks in all sectors of our societies, but in our quest to fight it, we have relegated many other development priorities, which threatens the attainment of sustainable development goals in LDCs. While reflecting on the effects of such unforeseen shocks, we must also consider the causal or catalyst role that climate change plays in their occurrence. The nexus between climate change and security takes many forms, but its impact is indiscriminate and consequential. Impacts like water scarcity, desertification, and cyclones will intensify competition for resources and create climate change refugees fleeing conflicts occasioned by those things. And sadly, LDCs bear the brunt of these phenomena. Despite only emitting 0.34 metric ton per capita of CO2, 30 times lower than emissions from high-income countries. Projections by the World Economic Outlook of the IMF indicate a 5.5% world output growth by 2021, 2.3% higher than that of LDCs in sub-Saharan Africa, worsening extreme poverty and existing inequalities. Don't get me wrong, Excellencies. LDCs welcome all discussions on climate security, but we must also insist that concrete solutions be found for enhancing climate adaptation and resilience for the most vulnerable countries. So as LDCs, we submit the following for your consideration in that regard. Number one, since the immediate task at hand is recovery from COVID-19 pandemic, it must be aligned with the goal to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius pursuant to the Paris Agreement. Number two, we commend the United States for joining the Paris Climate Accord, but existing commitments from developed countries and advanced developing countries to cut CO2 emissions are woefully inadequate. We therefore call on them to approach the 26th Conference of Parties, COP26, with more ambitious commitments. Number three, the UN Adaptation Finance Gap Report estimates that by 2030, adaptation costs will be around 140 to 300 billion US dollars per annum. This demands increasing both the scale of climate finance, including finance for adaptation and loss and damage, and its accessibility. Developed countries must therefore fulfill their commitments to provide $100 billion in climate financing annually in a predictable manner and answer our call for 50% of funding under the Green Climate Fund to be earmarked for adaptation and 50% of adaptation finance to be allocated to the LDCs and small island developed states. We want a binding commitment for these targets of COP26 at COP26 and the 5th UN Conference on LDCs, and we trust the Security Council will promote this. Number four, we commend the reforms by the Global Climate Fund to make disbursements of finances timely and approval of eligible projects easier. However, since past reports showed that less than a fifth of climate financing benefited local communities in LDCs, we urge that all agencies responsible for disbursements rectify this anomaly. 5, developed countries should actively and meaningfully transfer climate-friendly technologies to help LDCs build their capacity for adaptation and mitigation and accelerate green development. In closing, let me assure you, Excellencies, that our commitment as LDCs to deliver climate resilient development by 2030 and net zero emissions by 2050 remains intact, in line with the LDC Initiative for Effective Adaptation and Resilience, LIFE-AR. We therefore look forward to further engagement on these matters ahead of and during upcoming events like COP26 in Glasgow this coming November and the LDC 5 in Doha in January of 2022. I therefore thank the UN for supporting the preparatory African Regional Review meeting for LDCs, presently hosted by my country. I thank you all for your attention.
Thank you so much, Mr. President. And can I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Gaston Alfonso Brown, Prime Minister and Minister for Finance and Corporate Governance of Antigua and Barbuda. Prime Minister, you have the floor.
Thank you, Foreign Secretary. Distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the Alliance of Small Island States, EOSIS. Excellencies, make no mistake about it. Climate change's existential threat to our own survival is not a future consideration, but a current reality. Climate change and its adverse effects are threats to peace and security across the globe. The ever-increasing frequency and severity of tropical cyclones, droughts, sea level rise, desertification, all account for the displacement of populations and are drivers for national and international conflicts worldwide. For the past 30 years, EOSIS has been the single most consistent advocate on climate. Over that span of time, we have pressed for ambitious action through the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, its Kyoto Protocol, and its Paris Agreement, which remain today the primary international fora for determining the global response to climate change. As chair of EOSIS, I want to highlight the often overlooked threats faced by our small island developing states, SIDS, specifically in our fragility and more particularly our vulnerability. Excellencies, for SIDS, our peace and security can be decimated on multiple fronts, sometimes at a moment's notice, whether it be sea level rise, devouring our primary coastal and low-lying communities and territories, or more severe and frequent droughts and ocean acidification, literally undermining our water supply and food security, or even more severe and frequent tropical cyclones, rendering our states uninhabitable. On the latter front, this was not a hypothetical issue for my country. Our experience evacuating the citizens and residents of our sister island, Barbuda, in the aftermath of Hurricane Irma was nothing short of devastating. With a slight shift, the hurricane would have decimated Antigua as well, resulting in carnage similar to the consequences of war. In hindsight, I shudder to think what would have happened to the entire population of my country and what international plan and system would my country have recourse to in the aftermath of such an attack to our peace and security. All SIDS continue to live through constant assaults from climate change that undermine our peace and security. These include economic security, energy, water and food security, national security, territorial integrity, our people's right to self-determination, and state sovereignty. As a result, my fellow SIDS leaders and I are forced to govern in extremely challenging circumstances caused by climate change, among other factors. Excellencies, compounding these challenges is the international response to the root cause of these threats against SIDS peace and security, which is fragmented and quite frankly inadequate. SIDS have observed a glaring gap in the international community's pursuit for the widest possible cooperation by all countries for an effective and appropriate response. As a particularly vulnerable constituency that contributes least to climate change, we take this opportunity to remind states that we all have common but differentiated responsibilities to address climate change, its adverse effects, and associated loss and damage. In our work without an equitable, coordinated, and sufficient global response leaves SIDS with gross uncertainties in relation to our population's lives and livelihoods. Excellencies, this is not to say SIDS do not see the value in preventative action. On the contrary, we understand and continue to engage in adaptation actions as a means of preparing for the negative impacts of climate change. This is done to the greatest extent possible with the limited resources at our disposal. The pursuit of climate resilience is of the utmost importance to us, and there is considerable need for support from developed countries through grant and concessional financing, capacity building, and technology transfer to achieve this resilience. Furthermore, on preventative action, we cannot ignore the crucial necessity for all state parties to submit and, more importantly, implement ambitious, equitable, and evidence-based nationally determined contributions in line with the goals of the 2015 Paris Climate Accord. It is of paramount importance that all state parties reaffirm their unequivocal commitment to uphold the Paris Agreement and to take bold and decisive action to enhance their climate ambitions to achieve carbon neutrality. Excellencies, in light of the COVID-19 pandemic and its exposure of a whole range of compounding risk, which can exacerbate existing vulnerabilities and challenges, including climate change, we wish to stress that environmental accountability and the safeguarding of our natural heritage is crucial to our common humanity and the survival of our planet. There are nevertheless scientific limits to what SIDS can adapt to. As an international community, we must simultaneously plan and operationalize a system to address inevitable loss and damage, which uproots SIDS peace and security. This calls on us to provide equitable solutions that are in line with countries' international obligations and rights to systematically address difficult issues such as climate change, displacement, including the treatment of climate refugees and displaced persons and loss of territory. Having a truly international plan and a system for addressing these climate change-related disruptors to international peace and security will allow for its continued maintenance. Acknowledging that we live in an interconnected global economy, this organized and coordinated approach will benefit all parties concerned by providing some level of certainty on the required global response. I'm very aware that these are difficult topics, but on this matter, I must ask, if not us, who? If not now, when? On that note, I commend the United Kingdom in their presidency of the United Nations Security Council for the month of February for organizing this high-level open debate on climate-related risk to international peace and security. It is of utmost importance that we continue addressing this problem. Climate change demands inclusive governance solutions that involves adjusting old norms and incorporating new ideas. As climate change continues to threaten peace and security, SIDS are asking for all hands on deck. We therefore encourage the Security Council to continue to host high-level open on climate security discussions that are inclusive of UN member states, scientists, academia, and certainly civil society. In addition, we would like to see the development of an inclusive UN member state-driven climate security risk assessment tool that is both preventative and reactive to climatic events. Finally, Mr. President, for the past 30 years, small island and low-lying states have been sounding the alarm, sending the SOS distress signal. We are losing our territories, our populations, resources, and very existence due to climate change. The world is also facing this threat, and it is not by weapons, but by this invisible enemy, climate change, that we all agree is real. Sadly, SIDS to be on the front line of this war. Our appeal for the Council is to take this threat very seriously before it is too late. Thank you, distinguished ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you so much, Prime Minister, for your contribution and the particular insight. And I will now give the floor to His Excellency Heiko Maas, Federal Minister for Foreign Affairs of Germany. Heiko, you have the floor.
Mr. President, Excellencies, it is my honor to address the Council on behalf of the 54 members of the Group of Friends on Climate and Security, a broad and diverse group of countries from all continents. We are united by a common concern. Climate change is the existential threat of our times. Last year was once again the hottest year on record. We are witnessing storms, droughts, and flooding like never before. Degraded ecosystems and the loss of species threaten food security and our long-term survival. And the poorest and most vulnerable will suffer the most because fragile countries are disproportionately affected by climate change. And entire islands, nations, are at risk of disappearing. Ladies and gentlemen, the youth of the world is demanding action. We are putting their future, their safety, their well-being, and their health at risk if we don't act. I thank Prime Minister Johnson for showing leadership, and I can assure you, you can count on our support ahead of COP26 in Glasgow. And we are delighted to welcome the United States back on the Paris Agreement. We look forward to the new administration's re-engagement. Many countries, as well as the European Union, have been raising their level of ambition over the last months. But more needs to be done to make COP26 a real success. Mr. President, we need concerted effort by the entire United Nations system to make climate action its top priority. And I thank Antonio Guterres for his leadership on this. The evidence is clear. The effects on climate change fuel or further deepen conflicts. They make it harder to build peace, and they negatively affect social and gender equality. The United Nations have a key role to play in this. It can build on the progress we have already made, for example, with the establishment of the Climate Security Mechanism. Climate and security belongs firmly on the Security Council agenda to reflect its primary responsibility for international peace and security. Some progress was made by addressing climate change in many specific mandates and by establishing the informal expert group of members of the Security Council. But this is only the beginning. Last July, our friends from Nauru spoke here for the Group of Friends and presented the Council with a plan of action. Today, we are again calling for regular reporting by the Secretary General on the security implications of climate change, the appointment of a special representative for climate and security, climate-sensitive prevention, mediation, and peace building, training for all relevant United Nations personnel on the implications of climate change, on peace and security and humanitarian crisis. And finally, for more cooperation with civil society, regional and national actors on climate-related security risks. Last year, 10 members of the Security Council, including Germany, translated this plan into a draft resolution. Now is the moment to put a strong text back on the table and to adopt it. We stand ready to work with you towards achieving a resolution that reflects the points I just outlined. A strong resolution would demonstrate to the world that the Security Council is showing leadership on what is one of the gravest threats to peace and security of our times. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Heiko, for that contribution. And there are no more names inscribed on our list of speakers. So can I thank once again all the distinguished participants who have joined us today. Can I also thank the member states, the regional groupings, which have so far submitted both video recordings and or written submissions on the subject of today's discussions. Any further written statements that are received by the end of the day will form part of the formal record, and we look forward to receiving more. I think it's clear that listening to all member statements that the climate-related security risks are crucial, they are clear, they're very present for the world today and for the Security Council's attention. And as Sir David Attenborough said, climate change is a real risk to global security that can only be dealt with by unparalleled levels of global cooperation. The UK will continue to play its role, working very closely with all of you. And on that note, the meeting is adjourned.